welcome to the channel. If you enjoy captivating stories and intriguing content, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss an update. Also, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. I love seeing the amazing places our community comes from. Thanks for being here, and let's dive in. The morning fog rolled across San Francisco Bay as Margaret Chen adjusted her silk scarf and stepped into the gleaming lobby of Meridian Financial. For 15 years, she had walked these marble floors as the company's most trusted chief financial officer, a woman whose reputation for precision had built the firm's sterling credibility with pension funds and wealthy retirees across California. What none of them knew was that Margaret had been stealing from them for the past 7 years. It had started small, almost accidentally. A late Friday afternoon in 2016, when she discovered a rounding error in the quarterly statements that left nearly $30,000 in an orphaned account. The money belonged to no single client, existed in a gray area between legitimate investment returns and administrative oversight. She told herself she would return it after the weekend, after she figured out the proper allocation. But Margaret's daughter needed surgery that her insurance wouldn't cover. Her husband's restaurant was hemorrhaging money. The $30,000 disappeared into her personal account like water into sand. The beauty of Margaret's position was that she controlled both the client statements and the internal accounting. She could make numbers dance across spreadsheets, creating the illusion of growth where there was actually loss, of security where there was growing emptiness. She developed an elegant system. She would slightly inflate the returns shown to long-term clients who rarely questioned their statements, using their actual money to pay out the few who requested withdrawals. For years it worked flawlessly. Margaret's reputation grew. She spoke at conferences about fiduciary responsibility. She was featured in financial magazines as a model of ethical leadership. The irony wasn't lost on her, but she had learned to compartmentalize her life with surgical precision. The scheme might have continued indefinitely, but Margaret made a crucial error. She began to believe her own fiction. By 2022, she had siphoned nearly $40 million from client accounts. The money had funded a lavish lifestyle. A mansion in Marin County, luxury cars, European vacations, and private school tuition for her children. More dangerously, she had started making increasingly risky investments with the stolen funds, convinced she could generate enough returns to replace what she had taken and eliminate the evidence of her crimes. The markets, however, were not cooperating. Margaret's desperate attempts to recover her losses through cryptocurrency speculation and high-risk derivatives only accelerated the bleeding. The phantom millions she had created on paper were becoming impossible to maintain in reality. The unraveling began with a phone call on a Tuesday morning in March. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, an 82-year-old widow who had entrusted her late husband's pension to Meridian Financial, wanted to withdraw $200,000 to help her granddaughter buy a house. It was a simple request that should have taken 20 minutes to process. Margaret stared at her computer screen, watching the cursor blink in the account balance field. Mrs. Vasquez's account showed $1.2 million on paper, but the actual cash available was less than $50,000. The rest existed only in Margaret's carefully constructed maze of false documentation. "I'll need to process this through our secondary custody account," Margaret told Mrs. Vasquez over the phone, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. "It may take a few days." Those few days stretched into a week, then 2 weeks. Margaret frantically moved money between accounts, borrowed against lines of credit, and even considered taking out a personal loan to cover the withdrawal. But each desperate measure only made the situation worse. Mrs. Vasquez, growing suspicious, contacted her nephew who worked as a financial advisor. He suggested she request a complete audit of her account. When Margaret received that request, she knew her time was running out. The end came quietly, as these things often do. A junior accountant noticed discrepancies during routine reconciliation. An external auditor asked questions that Margaret couldn't answer. The state regulatory board launched an investigation that peeled back years of carefully constructed lies. On a foggy Thursday morning, much like the thousands of mornings before, Margaret Chen walked into the Meridian Financial lobby for the last time. Federal agents were waiting for her at the elevator, their badges glinting under the crystal chandeliers she had helped purchase with stolen money. The phantom millions had finally vanished, taking with them not just Margaret's freedom, but the retirement security of dozens of clients who had trusted her with their life savings. In the end, the most sophisticated part of her crime wasn't the technical manipulation of accounts, but the quiet erosion of trust that had taken 15 years to build and only moments to destroy. The champagne reception at the Ritz-Carlton in London was exactly the kind of event where fortunes were made and lost in whispered conversations. James Whitmore adjusted his Hermes tie and surveyed the room filled with investment bankers, hedge fund managers, and corporate executives. As a senior analyst at Blackstone and Associates, one of the city's most prestigious merger advisory firms, he belonged here among the financial elite. What made James dangerous wasn't his access to money, it was his access to information. For 3 years, James had been living a double life that would have impressed any spy novelist. By day, he was the consummate professional, analyzing potential mergers and acquisitions for Fortune 500 companies. By night, he was systematically trading on the confidential information that crossed his desk, building a secret portfolio that had already netted him over £12 million. The scheme was elegantly simple. James would learn about pending mergers weeks or months before they became public. A pharmaceutical company planning to acquire a biotech startup. A tech giant preparing to buy a promising artificial intelligence firm. A retail chain considering the purchase of an e-commerce platform. Each piece of inside information was worth millions to someone who knew how to use it carefully. James had learned to be very careful indeed. He never traded directly. Instead, he had cultivated a network of associates who operated at arm's length from his professional life. There was Marcus, a former university roommate who now managed a small investment fund in Switzerland. Sarah, a corporate lawyer he had dated years ago who now worked in Dublin. And David, his wife's cousin who had recently started a hedge fund in the Cayman Islands. The beauty of the system was its seeming randomness. James would share what appeared to be casual market observations during social gatherings. A comment about promising sectors during a dinner party. A suggestion about undervalued stocks during a weekend at the country club. His associates would act on these tips through their own trading accounts, and James would receive his share of the profits through a complex web of consulting fees and business partnerships. For 3 years the system worked flawlessly. James's lifestyle improved dramatically, but not conspicuously. He upgraded from a modest flat in Canary Wharf to a townhouse in Chelsea, but nothing that would raise eyebrows given his legitimate salary. He bought expensive art, but from emerging artists rather than established masters. He traveled frequently, but always with plausible business justifications. The first crack in his careful facade appeared during the Pemberton Industries acquisition. James had learned that the German conglomerate was planning to acquire the British manufacturing company for nearly £3 billion. It was the kind of deal that would send Pemberton's stock price soaring the moment it was announced. James followed his usual protocol, mentioning to Marcus during a seemingly casual phone call that manufacturing stocks looked particularly attractive. Marcus, based on this tip, invested heavily in Pemberton shares through his fund. When the acquisition was announced 2 weeks later, Marcus's investment doubled overnight. What James didn't know was that financial regulators had been monitoring unusual trading patterns around major acquisitions for months. The Pemberton deal triggered automated alerts at the Financial Conduct Authority. Too many people seemed to have made suspiciously well-timed investments in the company just before the announcement. The investigation began quietly, as these things always do. Regulators traced the trading patterns, looking for connections between the profitable traders and anyone with access to inside information. Marcus's fund appeared on their radar, then his personal connections, then his university records, then his relationship with James Whitmore at Blackstone and Associates. James first sensed trouble during a routine compliance meeting at his firm. The head of legal asked seemingly casual questions about his social connections, his investment activities, his communication with former colleagues. He answered truthfully but felt a chill of recognition. He had seen enough regulatory investigations to know the signs. That evening, James sat in his Chelsea townhouse, staring at the financial statements from his secret accounts. £12 million in profits, accumulated over 3 years of careful, systematic insider trading. He had been so focused on the mechanics of the scheme that he had never seriously considered the possibility of being caught. The walls began closing in with bureaucratic precision. Phone records were subpoenaed. Trading accounts were frozen. Associates were questioned. James watched his carefully constructed network unravel as each person faced the choice between cooperation and criminal charges. Marcus was the first to break. Faced with evidence of his suspicious trading patterns, he admitted to receiving tips from James in exchange for a lighter sentence. Sarah followed, then David. The house of cards collapsed with stunning speed. On a gray Tuesday morning in November, James Whitmore was arrested at his desk at Blackstone and Associates. His colleagues watched in stunned silence as financial crimes officers led him away in handcuffs. The man they had trusted with their most sensitive deals, the analyst whose judgment had seemed so sound, had been systematically betraying that trust for years. The insider's game was over. James had played it perfectly for 3 years, but perfection in financial crimes is always temporary. Markets may be unpredictable, but mathematics is not. Eventually, the patterns become clear, the connections become obvious, and the house always wins. As James sat in his cell awaiting trial, he reflected on the irony. He had spent his career analyzing corporate mergers, studying how companies absorbed each other, how value was created and destroyed. Now he understood that he had been absorbed too, not by another company but by his own greed, his own belief that he was smarter than the system designed to catch him. The £12 million was gone, seized by authorities. His reputation was destroyed. His career was over. The information that had made him wealthy had ultimately made him vulnerable, and the insider's game had claimed another player who thought he could never lose. The glass towers of Frankfurt's financial district gleamed in the morning sun as Dr. Elena Richter stepped out of her Tesla Model S, her designer heels clicking against the polished concrete of the underground parking garage. As Chief Technology Officer of Quantum Capital, one of Europe's most successful algorithmic trading firms, she commanded respect in a world where milliseconds could mean millions and where the right mathematical formula could generate wealth beyond imagination. What her colleagues didn't know was that Elena had discovered something far more valuable than any trading algorithm: a way to steal time itself. It had started 18 months ago, during the routine upgrade of Quantum Capital's high-frequency trading systems. Elena was reviewing the code that executed thousands of trades per second, looking for inefficiencies that could be optimized. The firm's success depended on speed. Being microseconds faster than competitors could mean the difference between profit and loss in the razor-thin margins of algorithmic trading. But Elena found something unexpected in the system's architecture. A tiny delay, barely measurable, that occurred between when the algorithm identified a profitable trade and when it executed that trade. The delay was built into the system's security protocols, designed to prevent exactly the kind of manipulation Elena was about to attempt. She realized she could exploit this delay. Elena began working late nights, ostensibly improving the trading algorithms but actually developing a parallel system that could intercept trading decisions before they were executed. Her shadow algorithm would identify the most profitable trades a few milliseconds before the main system acted, allowing her to execute identical trades through a personal account she had established with an offshore broker. The beauty of the scheme was its invisibility. Elena wasn't stealing money directly, she was stealing information about what her own algorithms were about to do, then using that information to trade ahead of her employer. The profits from her personal trades came from the market, not from Quantum Capital's accounts. To any observer, she was simply a skilled trader who had remarkable timing. The technical challenge was immense. Elena had to create a system that could operate within the firm's heavily monitored network without triggering security alerts. She embedded her code deep within the legitimate trading algorithms, disguising it as performance optimization routines. She routed her personal trades through a complex web of shell companies and cryptocurrency exchanges, making them virtually untraceable. For over a year, the system worked flawlessly. Elena's personal trading account grew steadily, generating returns that would have been impossible through legitimate means. She was careful to limit her profits to amounts that wouldn't trigger regulatory attention, usually no more than a few €100,000 per month. It was disciplined, systematic, and almost mathematically perfect. The money allowed Elena to live a lifestyle that seemed appropriate for a successful tech executive. She bought a penthouse apartment overlooking the main river, collected contemporary art, and traveled to conferences around the world. Her colleagues attributed her apparent wealth to savvy investments and stock options from previous startups. But Elena made one crucial error. She fell in love with her own creation. As the months passed, she became increasingly fascinated by the elegance of her system. She began taking larger positions, pushing the boundaries of what her algorithm could capture. She started documenting her methods, ostensibly for her own reference but actually out of pride in her technical achievement. She was creating the perfect financial crime and she wanted to preserve its beauty. The downfall began with a routine compliance audit. Quantum Capital's risk management team noticed unusual patterns in the firm's trading performance. The algorithms seemed to be slightly less profitable than expected, not enough to raise immediate alarms but sufficient to warrant investigation. They brought in external consultants to analyze the trading systems for any inefficiencies. Dr. Marcus Weber, the lead consultant, had spent decades analyzing algorithmic trading systems. He approached Elena's code with the systematic mindset of a digital archaeologist, examining every function and subroutine. He found Elena's hidden algorithms within a week. At first, Weber thought he had discovered a bug, code that was executing trades without proper authorization. But as he analyzed the patterns, he realized something far more sinister was happening. The unauthorized trades were too sophisticated, too perfectly timed to be accidental. Someone had built a parasite into the system, feeding off the host algorithm's decision-making process. The investigation that followed was a masterpiece of digital forensics. Weber's team traced the unauthorized trades through layers of obfuscation, following the electronic breadcrumbs Elena had left behind. They discovered the offshore accounts, the shell companies, the cryptocurrency transactions. Most damning of all, they found Elena's documentation, her proud record of how she had outsmarted her own employer's systems. On a cold January morning, Elena arrived at the office to find her access cards deactivated and federal financial crimes investigators waiting in the conference room. Her perfect algorithm had been dissected, analyzed, and understood. The months of careful planning and elegant execution had been unraveled by the same analytical mindset that had created the scheme in the first place. As Elena sat across from the investigators, she felt an unexpected sense of relief. For 18 months, she had been living a double life, constantly monitoring her system, constantly worried about detection. The weight of maintaining the perfect crime had been exhausting in ways she hadn't anticipated. The investigators showed her printouts of her trading records, charts showing the correlation between her personal trades and Quantum Capital's algorithms, evidence of her systematic theft of time and information. They asked her to explain how she had done it, not because they didn't understand, Weber's analysis had been thorough, but because they needed her confession to complete their case. Elena looked at the evidence of her perfect algorithm spread across the conference table. She had created something beautiful and terrible, a system that could steal microseconds and turn them into millions. She had proven that even in the heavily monitored world of high-frequency trading, human ingenuity could still find ways to exploit the system. But perfection, she realized, was always temporary. In a world where algorithms watched other algorithms, where every transaction was recorded and analyzed, even the most elegant crime would eventually be discovered. The perfect algorithm had worked flawlessly, right up until the moment it didn't. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of the Boston Harbor Hotel as philanthropist Victoria Ashford adjusted her pearls and surveyed the elegant ballroom filled with New England's most generous donors. Tonight's gala for the Children's Future Foundation would raise over $2 million for underprivileged youth programs across Massachusetts. Victoria, as the foundation's beloved executive director, would give another stirring speech about changing young lives through education and opportunity. What the assembled donors didn't know was that Victoria had been systematically stealing from the children she claimed to serve for the past 5 years. Victoria had built her reputation as a champion of children's causes through sheer force of personality and an uncanny ability to connect with wealthy donors. She spoke passionately about her own difficult childhood, her determination to break cycles of poverty, her vision of a world where every child could reach their potential. The stories were compelling because they were largely true. Victoria had indeed grown up in foster care, had struggled through college, had dedicated her early career to legitimate social work. But somewhere along the way, Victoria had discovered that good intentions were expensive to maintain. The Children's Future Foundation had started small, with Victoria working from a cramped office in Cambridge and personally visiting every program the foundation funded. But as donations increased and the foundation's reputation grew, Victoria found herself managing a complex organization with multiple programs, dozens of employees, and an annual budget exceeding $15 million. The temptation began with small compromises. Victoria authorized herself a modest salary increase, justifying it as necessary to retain talent. She upgraded the foundation's offices, arguing that donors expected professionalism. She hired her sister as a consultant, reasoning that family members would work harder for the cause. Each decision seemed reasonable in isolation, but together they formed a pattern of self-dealing that would eventually consume millions. Victoria's genius was in understanding that charity fraud was fundamentally different from other financial crimes. Donors wanted to believe their money was making a difference. They rarely demanded detailed accounting of how their contributions were spent. Board members, typically successful business people who volunteered their time, trusted Victoria's expertise and didn't want to micromanage day-to-day operations. This trust became Victoria's weapon. She began creating fictional programs that existed only on paper. The mobile learning labs that supposedly brought computer education to rural communities. The mentorship network that claimed to pair at-risk youth with professional role models. The emergency family support fund that provided crisis assistance to families in need. Each program had compelling mission statements, carefully crafted impact reports, and fabricated testimonials from grateful recipients. The actual money flowed into a web of shell companies and consulting agreements that Victoria controlled. She paid herself consulting fees for program development, facility management, and strategic planning. She built the foundation for conferences she never attended, equipment she never purchased, and services she never provided. The sophistication of Victoria's scheme lay not in complex financial instruments but in emotional manipulation. She had learned to weaponize compassion, using donors' desire to help children as cover for her systematic theft. When board members asked questions about program effectiveness, Victoria would respond with heart-wrenching stories about individual children whose lives had been transformed. When auditors requested documentation, she would provide carefully crafted reports filled with touching anecdotes and impressive-looking statistics. For 5 years, Victoria maintained the illusion perfectly. The Foundation's annual galas grew more elaborate, attracting celebrities and politicians who wanted to associate themselves with such important work. Victoria appeared on television talk shows, wrote op-eds in major newspapers, and spoke at national conferences about innovative approaches to youth development. She was featured in magazines as one of the most effective philanthropists of her generation. But Victoria's success became her vulnerability. As the Foundation's profile grew, so did scrutiny from potential donors who wanted to understand exactly how their money would be used. A particularly thorough foundation offered to provide $1 million grant, but only after conducting an extensive site visit to evaluate the Children's Future Foundation's programs. Victoria agreed to the visit, confident in her ability to maintain the facade. She had become so skilled at creating fictional programs that she believed she could sustain the illusion even under close examination. She arranged for actors to portray program participants, rented temporary facilities to serve as program sites, and coached staff members on the stories they should tell. The deception might have worked, except for a chance encounter at one of the supposed program sites. Dr. Sarah Chin, the Foundation representative conducting the evaluation, recognized one of the program participants as a struggling actor she had met at a community theater production. The recognition triggered a cascade of questions that Victoria couldn't answer convincingly. Dr. Chen's subsequent investigation revealed the full scope of Victoria's deception. The mobile learning labs didn't exist. The mentorship network was a fiction. The Emergency Family Support Fund had never helped a single family. Over 5 years, Victoria had diverted more than $8 million from legitimate children's programs to fund her increasingly lavish lifestyle. The end came swiftly. Federal investigators arrived at the Foundation's offices on a Tuesday morning in November, armed with search warrants and forensic accountants. Victoria watched from her corner office as agents seized computers, files, and financial records. The carefully constructed world she had built over 5 years crumbled in a matter of hours. The betrayal cut deepest among the donors who had trusted Victoria with their most generous impulses. Wealthy families who had donated millions believing they were changing children's lives discovered their money had purchased Victoria's mansion in Beacon Hill, her Mercedes-Benz, her expensive art collection, and her daughter's Ivy League education. As Victoria sat in federal custody awaiting trial, she reflected on the cruel irony of her situation. She had started with genuine desire to help children, had built a foundation that could have accomplished tremendous good, had attracted donors eager to support meaningful change. But her need for personal comfort had gradually consumed her charitable mission, turning her into exactly the kind of person she had once fought against. The charity mirage had finally dissipated, leaving behind only the harsh reality of betrayed trust and stolen hope. The children Victoria had claimed to serve would never benefit from the millions she had diverted. The donors who had believed in her vision would think twice before trusting another charitable cause. In trying to build something lasting, Victoria had destroyed not just her own life but the faith that others had placed in the possibility of making the world better. The morning fog rolled off the Thames as Patricia Hammond walked through the glass doors of Crescent Healthcare Group, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor of London's most prestigious medical staffing company. As Chief Operations Officer, she oversaw the placement of thousands of nurses, doctors, and specialists across Britain's private healthcare system. Her reputation for efficiency had made Crescent the go-to agency for hospitals desperate to fill critical staffing gaps. What the hospitals didn't know was that Patricia had been billing them for employees who didn't exist for the past 3 years. Patricia had built her career on genuine expertise in healthcare staffing. She understood the complex regulations governing medical personnel, the licensing requirements for different specialties, and the desperate need for qualified professionals in an overstretched system. Her knowledge made her invaluable to hospitals struggling with staff shortages and regulatory compliance. But Patricia had also learned that the healthcare staffing industry operated on trust and urgent need. When a hospital called at midnight needing an intensive care nurse for the next shift, administrators didn't have time for extensive background checks. They relied on agencies like Crescent to provide qualified personnel quickly and efficiently. The ghost payroll began almost accidentally. Patricia was processing invoices for a major London hospital when she noticed a discrepancy in the billing system. The hospital's records showed payment for a cardiac specialist who had actually been reassigned to another facility. The hospital had been billed for services never provided, but no one had noticed the error. Patricia corrected the mistake, but she couldn't stop thinking about how easily the system could be manipulated. Hospitals processed hundreds of staffing invoices each month, often under intense time pressure. Their accounting departments rarely cross-referenced billing records with actual staff assignments. The potential for fraud was enormous. She started small, creating a handful of fictional employees with believable credentials. Dr. James Fletcher, a locum consultant with impeccable references. Sarah Mitchell, an experienced theater nurse. Michael Chin, a physiotherapist with specialized training. Each ghost employee had carefully crafted backgrounds, complete with professional registrations and employment histories. The beauty of Patricia's system was its simplicity. She would assign ghost employees to hospitals during their busiest periods, when staff shortages made administrators grateful for any help. The fictional workers would be scheduled for shifts that coincided with legitimate staff members, making their presence seem natural. Patricia would then bill the hospitals for services that were actually provided by other employees or during periods when no additional staff was needed. The fraud escalated as Patricia's confidence grew. She began creating entire departments of ghost employees, billing hospitals for phantom nursing teams and imaginary specialist consultants. Her fictional workforce grew to include over 200 fake employees across dozens of healthcare facilities throughout England. The ghost payroll generated enormous profits for Crescent Healthcare Group, but more importantly, it generated substantial personal income for Patricia. She had structured the system so that she received bonuses based on the company's billing efficiency and client satisfaction. The ghost employees were her most profitable placements, requiring no actual wages while generating full billing rates. Patricia used the money to maintain a lifestyle that seemed appropriate for a successful healthcare executive. She purchased a Georgian townhouse in Kensington, sent her children to exclusive private schools, and took luxury vacations to destinations that impressed her professional colleagues. Her success seemed to validate the industry's faith in her abilities. The scheme unraveled when the National Health Service began implementing new digital systems to track medical personnel across the country. The computerized database was designed to improve patient safety by ensuring that all healthcare workers could be properly monitored and regulated. Dr. Amanda Richardson, the NHS administrator overseeing the new system, noticed anomalies in the data from private hospitals. Certain healthcare workers appeared to be working impossible schedules, providing services at multiple facilities simultaneously. Some employees seemed to exist in the staffing company records but had no corresponding entries in professional registration databases. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Patricia's deception. The ghost payroll included over 200 fictional employees who had collectively worked thousands of shifts over 3 years. The total fraud exceeded £12 million, money that had been diverted from healthcare budgets desperately needed for patient care. Patricia was arrested at her office on a Tuesday morning, surrounded by the personnel files that had made her fraud possible. As federal investigators examined her carefully maintained records of fictional employees, they discovered a woman who had turned her expertise in healthcare staffing into a sophisticated criminal enterprise. The ghost payroll had finally been exposed, revealing not just financial fraud but a betrayal of the healthcare system's fundamental trust. Patricia had exploited the urgent need for medical care, using hospitals' desperation to staff critical positions as cover for systematic theft. The money she had stolen could have funded legitimate healthcare services for thousands of patients. As Patricia faced trial, she reflected on how her intimate knowledge of healthcare staffing had become her criminal weapon. She had understood the system's vulnerabilities so well that she had been able to exploit them for years without detection. But the same digital systems that had made modern healthcare possible had ultimately made her ghost employees visible, exposing the phantom workforce that had enriched her while betraying every hospital that had trusted her with their most critical need. In the shimmering heat of a Texas June, the mirrored tower on Smith Street seemed to pulse with possibility. Its marble lobby smelled faintly of citrus polish, and the elevators whispered promises of fortune as they carried traders, accountants, and engineers to their open-plan command post. At the top, Jeffrey Skilling paced like a man who could see the future. He liked to say that risk was only a game of nerve, and few dared argue. Most felt honored merely to orbit his confidence. 26 floors below, Sharon Watkins adjusted the air conditioning vent above her cubicle. She kept her desk almost ascetically neat, aware that at Enron, clutter implied hesitation. Her title, Vice President of Corporate Development, sounded glamorous, but lately she had begun to dread each morning's spreadsheet. Numbers that should have balanced floated instead like will-o'-the-wisps. Intangible, seductive, never quite settling to earth. The discrepancy was small at first, concealed inside partnerships with charming names, Jedi, Choco, Raptors. Entities that CFO Andrew Fasto described as risk blankets. Yet the blankets felt too snug, as if they hid something alive and restless beneath the bed. When Watkins met Fasto in conference rooms, she noticed the way colleagues deferred to him. He exuded affability, open collar, easy laugh, but his eyes hardened whenever the talk drifted toward disclosure requirements. "Our investors are sophisticated," he assured. "They want growth. We give them growth." He spoke the words growth and trust as if they were synonyms. Still, Watkins could not forget the phantom profits. Billions conjured by moving debt off the books, spinning losses into revenue through the mirror of mark-to-market accounting. One July afternoon, she printed 20 pages of internal memos, tucked them into a manila envelope, and climbed to the executive floor. The carpet muffled her steps. She hesitated outside Skilling's office, palms slick on the knob before retreating, choosing instead to send a private letter to Chairman Ken Lay. Weeks passed. Lay praised her loyalty, promised an independent review, then offered a gentle suggestion. "Try to see the big picture, Sharon. Markets reward innovation." The phrase echoed in her ears like a hymn for restless nights. Meanwhile, the trading desks watched power prices spike across California. Rolling blackouts darkened neighborhoods in San Jose and San Diego, and Enron screens glowed with profits. Traders gave schemes playful nicknames, Death Star, Fat Boy, while families lit candles in stifling kitchens. At quarterly earnings calls, analysts cheered the company's predictable volatility, and the stock climbed past $90. Employees opened the online portal to funnel more of their retirement savings into shares emblazoned with the tilted blue E. Yet inside accounting, decimal points were sliding. A junior auditor discovered a $1.2 billion balance sheet adjustment that vanished into a footnote labeled equity reduction. He emailed his supervisor, who forwarded it to Fasto, who scheduled a private conversation and returned with the auditor's immediate transfer to another city, another division. Word spread in whispers beside vending machines. Question the numbers, lose your badge. October arrived with the first chill wind. Skilling resigned abruptly, citing personal reasons. The departure sent tremors through trading floors, but public statements insisted the vision remained unshaken. Fasto issued press releases calling liquidity robust. In a downtown bar, two former analysts clinked glasses and debated whether Enron might simply buy back any doubters. Speculation was oxygen, confidence, flame. Then, on the last Friday of the month, the Wall Street Journal published an expose on the hidden partnerships. The article detailed how Fasto had personally pocketed tens of millions in fees while guaranteeing Enron's debt with its own stock, a Mobius strip of assurances. That weekend, Watkins sat on her porch listening to the cicadas while reading the article aloud to her husband. Every sentence felt both vindication and looming catastrophe. Credit rating agencies circled like hawks. Within days they downgraded Enron's bonds 2 notches. Commercial lenders demanded additional collateral. Counterparties insisted on cash. Inside the Treasury Department, phones rang without pause, each call another vein of liquidity sealing shut. Traders began to unwind positions at a frantic pace, discovering that markets, once charmed, now recoiled. The share price fell faster than elevator floors descending at midnight. Fasto was escorted from headquarters carrying a single box. Employees watched through smoked glass as security badges deactivated with soft electronic chirps. Some cried. Many closed their 401k dashboards and whispered a prayer that the plunge would rebound by morning. It did not. On December 2, 2001, Enron filed for Chapter 11, the largest bankruptcy in American history at the time. In the hushed courthouse, Watkins testified before a congressional panel. Cameras clicked as she described the fragile machinery of confidence, the way trust could be bent into profit until it snapped. Lawmakers quoted her memo, turning accounting improprieties into a national refrain. Skilling claimed ignorance, Fasto pleaded guilty, and Lay insisted economic sabotage by short sellers, but the jury weighed motive against evidence, ambition against restraint, until verdicts emerged like stone tablets. Years later, the tower still stands, its lobby refurbished, its tenant directory replaced. New commuters glide past the brushed steel letters where Enron once proclaimed, "Ask why." Few recall the aroma of citrus polish, yet the story lingers in financial ethics courses and restless dreams of auditors who balance ledgers by desk lamp glow. They remember that fraud needed no violence, only a shared illusion, sustained by charismatic assurances and the silent fear of being the one who shouted, "Stop." At dusk, Houston's skyline catches the sun with the same deceptive brilliance it always had, as if nothing could ever go wrong beneath such orderly geometry. But somewhere a whistleblower rereads an old memo, and a trader reviews counterparty exposure, and an ordinary employee opens a retirement statement that never healed. The phantom profits have vanished, but the question remains, drifting through air-conditioned corridors. How many more towers are built on confidence alone, waiting for the next small necessary doubt? The Isar River moved quietly that June evening, reflecting the soft amber lights of Munich's tech district, where Wirecard's glass headquarters rose like a shard of promise. Inside the atrium, a subtle scent of espresso drifted from chrome machines, and employees still marveled at how a Bavarian startup had muscled its way into the blue-chip DAX index. They credited Markus Braun, the Austrian chief executive whose black turtlenecks and measured baritone lent him a faint, almost hypnotic gravity. He told them that cash was passé, that digital payments were destiny, and that Wirecard stood at the portal of a cashless future. Braun's closest lieutenant, Jan Marsalek, seemed built for secrets. Tall, smooth-cheeked, with a grin that could melt an audit, he handled operations. A mild word concealing exotic travel, shell companies, and late-night calls routed through Manila. Staff whispered that Marsalek kept multiple phones and preferred encrypted chats that vanished like cigarette smoke. Yet his charisma was undeniable. He walked the corridors as if the building itself owed him rent. Across the channel in London, journalist Dan McCrum stared at his monitor in the Financial Times newsroom, rereading a trove of leaked emails from a former Wirecard accountant in Singapore. The documents hinted at invoices that looped back on themselves, at customers that could not be found, at profits blooming in jurisdictions where regulators rarely knocked. McCrum felt the pulse of a larger deception but knew he was pitting ink against a billion-euro zeitgeist. Back in Munich, Braun convened quarterly meetings that felt more like revival sermons. Slides glided across jumbo screens, each one more dazzling than the last. Triple-digit growth in Asia, margins that rose even as competitors faltered. and a vault of segregated trust accounts, reportedly holding 1.9 billion euros in the Philippines. Investors applauded, analysts raised price targets, and Wirecard's share price climbed higher than the Olympic Tower. To question the miracle was to risk banishment from the party. Still, a few voices trembled. A junior risk officer noticed that some partner companies shared office addresses with a karaoke bar and a shuttered dental clinic. When she asked Marsalek for supporting contracts, he waved a hand, amused. "Our business," he said, "is borderless. The paperwork will catch up." She returned to her desk, uneasy, and watched colleagues purchase Wirecard shares with their annual bonuses. On the evening of April 27, 2020, KPMG released a long-delayed special audit. Portions of the report were redacted, but one sentence glowed like a flare. The auditors had been unable to verify the existence of the Philippine cash balances. Braun claimed the banks were slow, that pandemic lockdowns hampered courier services, that truth itself sometimes needed extra postage. Markets wobbled, yet many thought the turbulence would pass. Wirecard, after all, processed payments for half of Europe's online merchants. But Macrum's next article landed like a stone through cathedral glass. It described round-tripping, where Wirecard allegedly funneled its own money through shadow partners to fabricate revenue. The story ran with screenshots, signatures, timestamps. Braun called it fiction, and Marsalek promised lawsuits that would bankrupt the paper. Late that night, servers in Singapore hummed as employees shredded older printouts and wiped external drives, the neon city lights flickering against drawn blinds. June 18, 2020. Wirecard postponed its annual accounts for the fourth time, announcing that its auditor EY could not find confirmation for the famed 1.9 billion euros. The number sounded less like a balance and more like a myth. In Manila, both banks named in the footnotes issued statements within hours. Wirecard held no funds with them. By morning, Braun's composure cracked. He spoke of victims of sabotage and hinted at a conspiracy by hedge funds and hostile journalists. Yet even inside Wirecard, employees felt the ground tilt. Slack channels fell quiet. Expense claim portals froze. The collapse, when it came, was both swift and strangely silent. The stock plunged 70% in a single session, then vanished below the price of a train ticket. Credit lines evaporated, transaction partners fled. Braun resigned on a Thursday, arrested on a Tuesday, released on bail that Friday, then arrested again when prosecutors realized he had tried to move assets beyond reach. Cameras caught him in handcuffs, still wearing a black turtleneck, though now it seemed more like armor than style. Marsalek vanished entirely. German intelligence flagged his last known flight to Minsk, but rumors placed him in Russia, Dubai, or perhaps an estate outside Tripoli. Stories surfaced of him boasting about chemical weapons formulas and night vision drones, as if money laundering were merely one tile in a mosaic of clandestine fascinations. Interpol issued a red notice. Bounty hunters refreshed message boards. Yet the man himself dissolved into legend, leaving behind only snapshots of a grin too confident for daylight. Wirecard filed for insolvency on June 25, 2020, the first DAX company ever to do so. Employees packed belongings into cardboard boxes bearing the company's cheery logo. Some watched their stock-based pensions shrink to dust. Others struggled to explain to children how a thriving enterprise could disappear between Friday breakfast and Monday dinner. In conference rooms that still smelled faintly of success, half-finished cappuccinos cooled beside empty staplers. In court, Braun maintained that he too was deceived, that underlings inflated numbers beyond his sight. Prosecutors displayed emails in which he approved phantom revenue targets and urged faster onboarding of third-party acquirers. The judge listened, face impassive, while the gallery wondered whether self-delusion could ever be a legal defense. Each witness added new shades to the portrait. The compliance officer who flagged red alerts dismissed as noise, the IT specialist who built servers designed never to be audited, the regional manager who received bonuses wired from islands he had never visited. When the verdict finally arrived, it did not feel triumphant. It felt like the faint click of a vault door sealing shut on an era of credulity. Outside the courthouse, rain fell in gentle sheets, washing chalk protest slogans from the pavement. Munich's skyline glimmered as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. Yet somewhere, an intern updating a cash flow model hesitated, double-checked a figure, and remembered the 1.9 billion euros that were never there. And the Isar kept flowing, quiet and indifferent, beneath bridges where commuters still tapped phones to pay for tram rides, unaware or perhaps unwilling to recall just how easily numbers can shimmer, vanish, and take an empire with them. Night settled over Midtown like a velvet curtain, muting the city's usual roar. In the Lipstick Building on 3rd Avenue, the 21st floor remained softly lit, a hush broken only by printers sighing out trade confirmations. Bernard L. Madoff, immaculately pressed in a charcoal suit, moved among the modular desks as a maestro might tune an orchestra. He spoke little, employees understood his nods as gospel. To them he was Mr. M, the broker who seemed able to coax profit from any season, any storm. Clients adored the certainty he sold. On Park Avenue, retired surgeons boasted that their nest eggs grew at a steady 1% a month, no matter what the Dow decided. In Palm Beach, country club whispers likened Madoff to an alchemist. He never chased a rally, never bled in a crash. Statements arrived printed on crisp parchment, the numbers climbing with metronomic grace. Such symmetry felt almost moral, like a covenant between caution and reward. Hidden 2 floors above, however, a windowless room told another story. The traders there referred to it, half-jokingly, as the factory. Its gray carpeting bore no corporate logo, only paths worn by uneasy pacing. A pair of IBM mainframes stood against one wall, their green screens frozen on manual inputs. Dates, securities, quantities, entire positions keyed by hand. Frank DePascali, Madoff's longtime lieutenant, oversaw the ritual. He selected random blue-chip stocks after markets closed, fed them into a proprietary program, and out came perfect rings of buys and sells, backdated to prove prescient timing. The algorithm did not predict the future. It rewrote the past. DePascali often wondered how long luck could masquerade as genius. Still, loyalty and fear braided tight inside him. Madoff's approval felt like sunlight, his disappointment an eclipse. Besides, clients never demanded original trade tickets. They craved the illusion more than the evidence. One autumn morning in 2005, Harry Markopoulos, a Boston analyst with an eye for irregular patterns, spread 11 years of Madoff's reported returns across his dining room table. They formed an almost straight line rising gently to the right, defying every bump the market had suffered. Black Monday, the Asian contagion.com collapse. He felt a chill that was not from the Massachusetts winter. In mathematics, noise is inevitable. Here, noise had been airbrushed away. Markopoulos drafted a memo for the Securities and Exchange Commission, titled, "The World's Largest Hedge Fund is a Fraud," and mailed it registered post. Months passed, then years. The SEC thanked him for his diligence and filed the warning like a misplaced umbrella. Meanwhile, new money flowed in a widening river. French aristocrats, Japanese pension funds, and a swarm of feeder funds in tiny offshore jurisdictions all wired capital to Madoff Securities. Each believed itself part of a privileged circle, unaware that the circle encompassed thousands. When withdrawals arose, college tuition, a beachfront renovation, Madoff simply tapped the incoming tide. He called it Raoul Wallenberg financing, rescuing one with another's aid, a gallows joke that few inside the factory found funny. December 2008 arrived harsh and brittle. Lehman Brothers lay in ruins. Investors everywhere lunged for liquidity. Requests for redemptions reached $7 billion in a week, far more than the paltry $300 million resting in the firm's primary account. Madoff walked the carpeted corridor to his office, closed the door and stared at the skyline. Snowflakes drifted beyond the glass like static on an old television. He had survived bear markets before, but only because faith had outweighed fear. Now fear ruled. He summoned his 2 sons, Mark and Andrew, to a private meeting. They expected routine strategy, perhaps a plan to reassure clients. Instead, their father's voice trembled as he confessed there were no investments, no split-strike conversions, no option collars hedging risk. "It's all one big lie," he said. "A giant Ponzi scheme." The words floated in the room like shards of ice. The sons retreated, nausea rising, then phoned an attorney. Within 24 hours, the FBI knocked at the apartment on East 64th Street, where Madoff sat in a leather chair as if awaiting a delayed appointment. He told the agents almost politely, "I know you're here. The name is Bernie Madoff." News spread faster than any dividend rumor. Couples in Boca Raton stared at television screens, mouths ajar. Congregants at Temple Beth El pressed mute on Friday services to check their phones. One widow realized that the steady checks funding her medications came not from profit but from neighbors' principle. She folded the latest statement and slid it into a drawer, uncertain whether to keep it as evidence or burn it as betrayal. At the courthouse, Madoff stood without expression while prosecutors outlined losses approaching $65 billion, a number so vast reporters stumbled over the syllables. He pleaded guilty, 11 counts ranging from securities fraud to money laundering, yet even in confession clung to a narrow vanity. He insisted the scheme began only after legitimate strategies stopped working in the early 90s. DePascali's testimony suggested otherwise. The factory, he said, had operated since at least 1992, maybe earlier, each forged trade another stitch in the emperor's invisible cloak. Judge Denny Chin delivered a 150-year sentence, calling the crime extraordinarily evil, a phrase that echoed through marble halls. Some victims nodded in grim satisfaction. Others felt only emptiness, as though justice were a glass of water offered after a house had burned down. In prison, Madoff shuffled between chemo treatments and chipped chess pieces, occasionally acknowledging visitors with the same courteous nod that once promised safety. Wall Street adjusted its mirrors. Regulators pledged new safeguards, feeder fund managers released remorseful letters, and auditors downloaded fresh compliance templates. Yet the deeper bruise lay in quieter places. A piano that had belonged to Mark Madoff, who later took his life. A scholarship fund in Madrid that had to shut its doors. A generation of savers who now traced every line of every statement, fearful of arithmetic that seemed too straight. On certain evenings, the lipstick building's lights still glow for unrelated tenants. But those who remember glance up and feel a fleeting unease. They picture a narrow office, mahogany desk, and a man who spoke gently of modest gains, weaving a silken web strong enough to snare the world, until one winter gust revealed it as nothing more than threads and wishes, drifting toward the East River in silent, irreversible unravel. On a damp October morning in 2007, the lobby of the McGraw-Hill building breathed recycled notes of aftershave and fresh toner. Elevators pinged softly, ferrying analysts toward a blur of Bloomberg terminals. 27 floors up, Raj Rajaratnam occupied a corner office with the hush of deep carpet underfoot and the subtle dominance of a single jade bonsai on his desk. From that green island he directed Galleon Group, a $4 billion hedge fund celebrated for instincts that seemed almost clairvoyant. Colleagues credited his Sri Lankan lilt and easy laugh, but Raj prized only one trait: information. He called it the edge, whispering the phrase like a psalm. Traders on his floor understood that edge arrived through private lines. A pharmaceutical scientist glimpsing trial results, a chip designer testing a prototype, a vice president who felt underpaid. No one said the word tip, yet each coded text, each midnight call fed the same hunger. One voice grew indispensable. Rumi Khan, a former Intel employee with a steel-trapped memory, now worked as an independent consultant. She phoned Raj from a Starbucks patio in Santa Clara, murmuring about a coming earnings miss at Intel. Raj placed the call on speaker, scribbled 3 numbers, and closed the connection with a gentle "Thank you, dear." Seconds later, his traders sold 2 million Intel shares, hedged the position with options, and watched the stock sink precisely as predicted. The profit looked clean on paper. The thrill felt even cleaner. Across Midtown, in a drab FBI cubicle, Special Agent Brookman clicked replay on a wiretap labeled "Call 198 Khan Raj." His headphones caught a static veiled sentence. "Remember, we spoke only at Temple." Brookman jotted the phrase, sensing the outline of a conspiracy. Conversations moved from office to pew, from boardroom to bodega, always just beyond fluorescent light. The FBI dubbed it the Whisper Network. Back at Galleon, Raj cultivated loyalty with precise generosity. He treated junior analysts to late-night dosa and mango lassi, asking about their families, then quizzing them on semiconductor inventories. Fear rarely appeared. Raj's authority thrived on warmth. Yet beneath the surface, staff maintained a silent ledger of owed favors. When he signaled, "Find me color" on Google, they sprinted through alumni lists and LinkedIn backdoors until someone's roommate agreed to coffee. That roommate returned to Mountain View with non-disclosure decals on his badge and a secret twitch in his conscience. The conscience of one, however, began to stutter. Anil Kumar, a senior partner at McKinsey & Company and Raj's former Wharton classmate, had supplied market-moving whispers for years, pocketing $500,000 consulting fees wired to a Singaporean account in his housekeeper's maiden name. Kumar enjoyed the game, until his teenage son wrote an ethics essay for civics class, praising transparency as society's backbone. Kumar read the paper at midnight under a desk lamp and felt sweat pool in his collar. He had taught the boy chess Sanskrit truth. Now the clandestine phone in Kumar's study rang, its ringtone sampled from a temple bell. He let it ring 8 times before answering. In Washington, the SEC fumbled another insider trading complaint, missing names, misdating contacts. A junior attorney, Christina Porter, sifted through paperwork and found references to Raj in 3 separate settlements. The pattern glinted like broken glass in river mud. She flagged the file, and within weeks, Porter joined the FBI task force, her meticulous timelines pairing with Brookman's taped calls. December winds sharpened. Telecom executive Danielle Cheesy, glamorous, brash, and famous for hugging sources hard enough to feel their pulse, strode into Galleon's offices wearing a winter white coat. She leaned against Raj's doorframe, eyes bright. "AMD's quarter is toast," she whispered. "Hector knows but won't blink until the call." Raj nodded. Orders flew, millions shifted. The fund's rising chart looked pure, untouched by those murmured frost cloud words. Yet each breath on the phone traced its own path into FBI servers. The agents built a scoreboard: tip, trade, profit. 46 calls, 53 trades, $70 million. They needed one break, a human moment in which fear outran greed. It came from Anil Kumar. Approached discreetly outside Penn Station, he listened as Porter outlined maximum sentences, asset seizures, the damage to his son's college fund. Kumar's shoulders sagged. He signed a cooperation agreement and days later, entered Raj's office wearing a miniature recorder disguised as a Mont-Blanc pen. They spoke of family first, cricket scores, weddings, then Kumar murmured about an upcoming tech acquisition. Raj's response sealed the case: "We'll be in before the street even sniffs." The phrase crackled through the pen circuitry all the way to a van idling near Radio City Music Hall. Before dawn on October 16, 2009, Raj awoke to a fist's percussion on his Sutton Place door. He opened it in navy pajamas, spectacles slipping down his nose, as agents recited charges of securities fraud and conspiracy. Cameras stationed at the curb captured the slow walk to an unmarked sedan. By lunchtime, the news scroll on CNBC flashed hedge fund Titan falls. Investors who once begged for a slice of Galleon now begged brokers to unwind what remained. The trial unfolded the next spring. Prosecutors played wiretap after wiretap. Rumi Khan coaching Raj to use the usual phones, Cheesy cooing, "I have friends in low places," Kumar apologizing for lighting the fuse. Jurors leaned closer each time Raj's voice surfaced. Calm, cordial, undeniably aware. His defense painted him as merely well-connected, but the tapes reduced that brushstroke to an outline of culpability. After 11 weeks, the verdict arrived: guilty on all 14 counts. A hush followed, heavy with unspoken math. Up to 11 years per count. Judge Richard Holwell eventually settled on 11 years total, still one of the longest insider trading sentences in U.S. history. Raj listened without visible tremor, yet his right hand, resting on the defense table, turned a slow half-circle, as if tracing invisible stock charts one last time. Galleon dissolved. Desks cleared, monitors darkened, the bonsai was left behind, its leaves beginning to yellow under inconsistent watering. Midtown moved on. New funds raised capital, new slogans promised ethical alpha, but young analysts swapped one extra glance when someone offered a sure thing whispered over sushi. On certain nights, Special Agent Brookman replays Call 198. Static, a laugh, the words, "Remember we spoke only at Temple." The Whisper Network had mistaken proximity for invisibility, loyalty for law. It had thrived in half-lit corners until a single conscience flickered, then split the darkness. Somewhere up the Hudson, in a low-security facility, Raj stares past chain link at the same dusk that once gilded skyscraper glass, wondering which moment, which word, first loosened the thread that unraveled the whole exquisite edge. The January dawn broke silver over Paris, glancing off the glass towers of La Défense and sliding into the vast trading floor of Société Générale. Rows of monitors winked awake, their blue glow bleaching the faces of traders who gulped espresso like medicine. Among them sat Jerome Kerviel, 30 years old, slight, almost forgettable in a gray suit that wrinkled at the elbows. He had no private office, no pedigree from the grandes écoles, yet colleagues secretly envied the quiet speed of his fingers and the confidence with which he rode the global futures markets. Kerviel's mandate was modest, low-risk arbitrage, skimming fractions of a percent from tiny price gaps. But modest never paid for dreams he carried from Brittany: a seaside house for his widowed mother, respect from Parisians who considered him provincial, a place among the whispered legends of finance. So inch by inch he stepped beyond the fence. First came oversized bets disguised as customer orders. Then false hedges, like mirrors set opposite each other to create the illusion of balance. Each fabricated offset neutralized scrutiny in the bank's overnight checks. The trades themselves, however, grew monstrous, stretching across indexes in Germany, France, and beyond, tens of billions that should have required signatures from board members, yet sat in the hands of a single junior trader. His screens became a private theater. He watched markets swing and felt an intoxicating power, as if he could bend weather. Nights found him still at his desk, jacket slung over the chair, entering one more code to mask the day's position. Security guards learned to leave him be. The hum of servers and the click of his keyboard formed their own nocturnal lullaby. Compliance systems flashed yellow warnings, transactions too large, too frequent. But Kerviel answered each query with supporting documents he forged in minutes. The bank's control team, overloaded and trusting, filed the explanations and moved on. Risk managers saw profits so smooth they looked predestined. Executives, dazzled by numbers, praised the resourcefulness of their rising star. No one asked why his gains lacked the usual tremor of chance. No one peered behind the hedges made of smoke. Across the Seine, a journalist at Le Monde noted that Société Générale's equity derivatives desk had become the envy of Europe, posting record returns even as American subprime fears darkened trading floors worldwide. She wondered idly who inside the bank wove such steady magic. The answer lay hidden in Kerviel's growing stack of unauthorized tickets, each one a brick in an invisible wall rising around him. Then came Friday, January 18, 2008. European markets stumbled on recession whispers from the United States. Kerviel's positions, enormous and one-sided, lurched into loss. He stayed at his desk through the weekend, fingers interlaced behind his neck, watching futures bleed red. Monday promised worse. An American holiday with thin liquidity, magnifying every twitch. By dawn he knew the facade could not hold. The fictitious hedges no longer matched anything real. The mirrors cracked, showing only depth. That morning, an internal controller named Marie-Angelique Delamar noticed irregular entries tied to Kerviel's ID. She asked him for clarification. His answers, usually glib, arrived tangled. She escalated to her supervisor, who confronted Kerviel after lunch beside a row of humming printers. He admitted anomalies but downplayed the scale. They gave him until evening to provide paperwork. Instead, he walked outside into cold air, crossing the plaza beneath the Grande Archie, feeling for the first time the weight of everything he had borrowed from fate. Within 24 hours, the bank pieced together the real exposure: 50 billion euros, more than the entire market value of Société Générale itself. Shock traveled upward like an electric surge. Chairman Daniel Boughton convened an emergency meeting inside a wood-paneled conference room that smelled of stale coffee and panic. Traders were ordered to unwind Kerviel's positions immediately, selling into a falling market that sensed distress and pounced. The cost of closing the trades ballooned to 4.9 billion euros, a wound deep enough to stagger one of Europe's oldest banks. News broke on January 24th. Headlines spoke of a trader foe, a madman. Television anchors camped outside La Défense, their breath-fogging camera lenses. Kerviel surrendered at a neighborhood police station, walking past reporters who thrust microphones like spears. Inside a gray interrogation room, he explained that he had merely gone with the flow, that the bank had profited for years from his audacity and turned away, as long as the curve pointed upward. Investigators listened, stone-faced, unsure whether to see a criminal mind or a symptom of corporate blindness. Parisians debated over espresso counters. Was he a villain or a scapegoat? Some admired the audacity of a clerk who had out-traded titans. Others focused on pensioners whose savings sat in the bank's shares, now depleted. Late-night talk shows displayed graphics of zeros trailing across the screen like a comet's tail. In court, Prosecutors painted Kerviel as a manipulator who forged emails and rubber-stamped confirmations. Defense lawyers argued the bank nurtured a culture where risk-taking was currency and controls were lace curtains. Delicate, decorative, easily brushed aside. Judges weighed intent against environment and delivered a sentence of 5 years, 2 suspended, plus restitution that could never realistically be paid. The figure, $4.9 billion, hung in the air like a number from fiction. Kerviel emerged from prison after a short span, slipping into anonymity broken only by occasional interviews in modest cafes. He spoke of regret laced with residual pride, as if he still felt the pulse of markets in his wrists. Société Générale patched its balance sheet, replaced managers, tightened controls, and issued training modules on ethical boundaries. Yet inside trading rooms worldwide, young quants sometimes look up from errant profit curves and imagine the lure of that forbidden scale, the fantasy of moving continents from a single swivel chair. At dusk, the towers of La Défense mirror the sky in flawless panes, giving no hint of the storm once hidden behind their glass. Cleaners pass over carpets where frantic footsteps once raced to contain a 5-day cataclysm born of years of silent excess. And somewhere a lone ex-trader, walking a Breton shoreline, hears the sea and recalls how screens once seemed as boundless as the horizon, until the tide came in and revealed the sand beneath his feet. Morning fog rolled off the Thames and coiled among the towers of Canary Wharf, softening the chrome edges of London's newest cathedrals to finance. Inside the UBS dealing room, screens glowed turquoise, lines of numbers rushing upward like mercury in a fever chart. Tom Hayes, a boyish derivative trader with rust-colored hair and darting eyes, adjusted his headset and glanced at the digital clock above the exit. It read 10:28, 92 minutes until the daily LIBOR submission that set interest costs for mortgages, student loans, and trillion-dollar swaps across the globe. Hayes treated that clock as both dominion and deadline. Officially, each bank was meant to estimate the rate at which it could borrow unsecured cash from peers. Unofficially, the figure floated on whispers, coded jokes, and handshakes brokered over pints in the snug bars of Bishopsgate. Hayes understood LIBOR's curious fragility. It was a benchmark built on self-reporting, not actual trades, and therefore bent easily under the weight of persuasion. He opened a chat window titled 3 Lions where the banter moved quick as alley cats. "Need a low 3M today," he typed. "Any help?" Seconds later, a broker answered with a winking emoticon. "No worries, mate, we'll ring the others." Hayes clicked away, pulse steady. A single basis point nudge could add £250,000 to his book. 5 banks working in chorus could shift the world's compass by degrees invisible to the public yet lucrative in the daily P&L. Down the corridor, risk manager Nina Thompson leafed through a printout of prior submissions. Patterns emerged. UBS routinely posted rates on the low side each quarter end, mirroring the exact biases that advantaged Hayes' positions. She flagged the sheet with a neon tab and walked it to compliance. The director, shoulders tight under a tailored jacket, thanked her and filed the note in a drawer already thick with uneasy coincidences. Quarterly bonuses glimmered on the horizon. No one wished to call the fire brigade while the party lights still dazzled. Around noon, the British Bankers Association published the day's LIBOR fix. Hayes' spreads widened precisely as planned. He celebrated with an instant noodle cup, head bowed like a monk over a sacred bowl, before flipping to the afternoon's yen contracts. In Tokyo, counterparts towed the same invisible line, trusting Hayes to reciprocate when their turn came. The network spanned time zones, trading floors, and brokerage desks, held together by favors and the unspoken credo: "You look after me, I'll look after you." Yet every system records its own heartbeat. The U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission, sifting routine data, spotted anomalies. On certain dates, clusters of banks moved rates in near lockstep, out of sync with market evidence. Investigators requested chat logs. Compliance officers obliged, boxed files arrived in Washington, and transcripts printed on recycled paper told a story of emojis and half-serious bribes. A steak dinner for a higher 6-month fix. Need it low, we'll drop off that Dom P later. The informality shocked lawyers, but for traders it had been simple shorthand for ambition. Hayes noticed the first tremor in December 2010, when UBS announced an internal review. Desks fell strangely quiet. Brokers who once answered with banter now asked who else was copied on the line. He consoled himself that everyone had dipped into the same pond. "They can't jail the whole city," he joked to a colleague, although the laugh stuck in his throat. In July 2012, the dam burst. Barclays paid hefty fines and released emails referencing lowballing. Regulators widened the lens to UBS, Citigroup, Deutsche Bank. Hayes found his name underlined in 3 jurisdiction subpoenas. He rode the DLR home that night, watching Canary Wharf recede like a ship ablaze, illuminating fog that refused to rise. The Serious Fraud Office arrested him at dawn, agents filling his modest Surrey kitchen while the kettle shrieked. They read charges of conspiracy to defraud. He offered tea. His wife, still in pajamas, held their infant son and stared at the floor tiles, as if numbers might appear there to balance the equation. At Southwark Crown Court, the prosecution projected chat excerpts onto a wall. Jurors, most with variable rate mortgages pegged to LIBOR, absorbed words like "spoof it a tad higher" and "my coffers await your magic touch." Hayes testified in nervous bursts. He claimed managers knew that manipulation was industry norm, that he once received a commemorative bottle of Bollinger for a timely nudge. The defense painted him as an Asperger's afflicted savant craving peer approval, not criminal profit. But the emails felt immune to sympathy, they pulsed with intent. Judge Jeremy Cook addressed the packed gallery. "The message must be clear: integrity of financial markets is not a game." He issued a 14-year sentence, later trimmed on appeal to 11. Reporters noted the irony. A man who shifted microscopic decimals would now count freedom in long, indivisible years. Banks paid nearly $10 billion in cumulative fines. CEOs apologized before parliamentary committees. New algorithms replaced human judgment in rate setting. Yet the wounds ran beyond balance sheets. A Lancashire homeowner calculated that a mid-2000s LIBOR tweak had cost his family an extra £1,800 in interest. A non-profit refinancing its shelter loan discovered it had overpaid enough to fund 2 additional beds each winter. The benchmark, once a silent metronome to the global economy, had been exposed as a clock whose hands moved at the whim of those who watched it most closely. On misty evenings, Canary Wharf's lights shimmer across the Thames, reflected but untouchable. Office cleaners empty bins beneath suspension ceiling fluorescents that mask any trace of the traders who once bartered time itself. Somewhere in Wandsworth Prison, Tom Hayes folds laundry for a few pence an hour, glancing occasionally at a wall-mounted clock he cannot edit. Its tick steady, incorruptible, indifferent to the man who learned too late that some numbers, once fixed, will not move for any favor, emoji, or whispered plea. Twilight draped the Wolfsburg plant in dusky blue, the chimneys of Volkswagen's main factory standing like solemn organ pipes against the sky. Inside Building 18, a fluorescent hush hummed over rows of test benches where engineers in white coats monitored engines the public had yet to see. Oliver Schmidt, chief of emissions compliance for the United States market, leaned against a stainless steel rail and watched a 2.0-liter diesel idle on rollers. On the screen above the exhaust probe, nitrogen oxide levels traced a tame, green line. It looked immaculate, almost too immaculate, and Schmidt felt both relief and a faint twinge of unease. A decade earlier, Volkswagen's board had issued a mandate: crack the American market with clean diesels. Gasoline hybrids were stealing headlines, but diesel promised torque, highway mileage, and German mystique. Chief Executive Martin Winterkorn demanded nothing less than perfection. "No compromises," he said, his Swabian baritone thudding off conference room walls. Targets were set: meet the U.S. standard of 0.043 grams of NOx per mile, 4 times stricter than Europe's, without sacrificing performance or cost. Engineers tried lean NOx traps, urea injection, microscopic tweaks to combustion timing, yet each prototype stumbled in road tests. Deadlines loomed. Then, late one night in 2006, a software developer proposed a workaround: an algorithm that sensed when the car was on a regulatory dynamometer. Steering wheel angle at 0, wheels turning but rear axle still, barometric pressure constant, engine warmed within a narrow band. These told the code it was exam day. The engine computer would then flip to dyno mode, dialing back fuel and retarding timing to sip emissions. Once the car returned to real roads with steering input and altitude changes, street mode reawakened full torque, and NOx levels soared unseen. Some called it the switch, others the defeat device. Officially, it was just Alternative Emission Strategy 2. Winterkorn never saw the code, but lieutenants assured him the U.S. launch was greenlit. Glossy ads followed, blue skies, mountain passes, young couples refueling half as often. Sales rose, awards stacked up. American buyers who once scoffed at diesel embraced a technology that seemed to marry thrift and conscience. Yet technology has a set. On a freeway outside Los Angeles in 2012, John German, a laconic engineer at the International Council on Clean Transportation, paced beside a silver Jetta TDI while sensors strapped to its tailpipe inhaled data. He expected modest deviations from lab numbers, road grade, wind resistance. But the analyzer screamed multiples of the legal limit, as though the car exhaled fumes from a bygone decade. German raised an eyebrow, checked calibration, ran the loop again. The result worsened. He phoned a colleague, "I think we've got a ghost in the machine and it stinks." The ICCT partnered with West Virginia University's Transport Lab, whose graduate students welcomed the mystery. They borrowed a Passat and a BMW X5 as control, driving from San Diego to Seattle with portable emissions gear rattling in the trunk. Data spooled into laptops. The BMW hovered near compliance, but the Volkswagen spewed up to 40 times the NOx limit. The students, awed and jittery, drafted a paper that crossed the Atlantic to Germany's Federal Motor Transport Authority and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Regulators blinked, then demanded answers from Volkswagen's American subsidiary. Oliver Schmidt flew to Michigan for crisis meetings. He projected tidy graphs, blamed technical irregularities, promised a software update. Behind closed doors, he vented frustration. They caught the tail, not the tiger. In Wolfsburg, engineers scrambled to develop a patch that could pass muster without gutting horsepower. Winterkorn paced his top-floor office under the iconic VW logo, chain-smoking and scowling at quarterly forecasts. The board weighed the cost of a full recall against the hope that regulators might accept a polite apology and minor fix. September 18, 2015 ended speculation. The EPA issued a notice of violation stating bluntly that Volkswagen had installed defeat devices in nearly 500,000 U.S. vehicles. Stock traders read the alert before their second espresso. By lunchtime, VW shares had plummeted €20 billion in value. In showrooms from Tucson to Tallahassee, salespeople stood beside gleaming Golfs and tried not to look at the floor. The public reckoning unfolded with methodical cruelty. Congressional hearings summoned executives who, palms raised, spoke of chain of errors and misinterpretations. Emails leaked, mid-level managers fretting over "our old cheat," PowerPoint slides labeling the code AKF-47, a private joke mixing German acronyms and the rifle model, as if the software were a weapon. Winterkorn resigned, citing shock and sorrow. His successor, Matthias Müller, likened the company to a man needing open-heart surgery. Meanwhile, investigators in Braunschweig combed through servers. One engineer, James Leong, chose cooperation, describing conference calls where options were laid out starkly: redesign the catalyst at ruinous cost or accept the device as a stopgap. The stopgap lasted almost a decade. Liang's testimony implicated supervisors. Supervisors named directors. Oliver Schmidt, arrested at Miami International while boarding a flight home, faced a judge who read 8 felony counts. Schmidt swallowed, adjusted his tie, and prepared for years in a Michigan penitentiary. Volkswagen allocated €30 billion for buybacks, repairs, and penalties, the largest payout in automotive history. Owners lined up at dealerships to hand back keys. Some cried, more cursed. Environmental lawyers calculated excess pollution had shortened thousands of lives. In a Detroit suburb, a science teacher used the scandal as a cautionary tale. When the numbers look perfect, ask what slipped the test. Yet the roads did not empty of Volkswagens. Mechanics reflashed ECUs, cars returned compliant but sluggish. The brand launched an electric vehicle push, its ads now whispering contrition. Still, each time a diesel Golf accelerates onto the Autobahn, someone may wonder which personality hides beneath the hood. On cold evenings in Wolfsburg, the chimneys still glow red, workers change shifts, and the canal beside the factory steams. The buildings appear unaltered, but a faint imprint lingers like soot on white paint, proof that even in an age of sensors and algorithms, deception needs only 2 things: an impossible target and minds agile enough to slip beyond the measuring eye until daylight, data, and one persistent question finally catch the vanishing fumes. The hills around Parma ripened under a late summer haze, their rows of vines arching toward the old city's terracotta roofs. From an upper balcony of Villa Tanzi, Callisto Tanzi surveyed his domain, Parmalat, the dairy empire he had coaxed from a one-room pasteurization shop into a multinational colossus. Newspapers hailed him as Il Re del Latte, the Milk King. He wore the crown lightly in cardigan sweaters and an avuncular smile, but inside the boardroom his stare could curdle cream. Parmalat's secret weapon was long-life UHT milk, its cartons stacked like white bricks in supermarkets from Naples to Newark. Tanzi insisted growth must never stall. He pressed managers to acquire juice labels in Brazil, bakeries in Hungary, even a TV network in Rome. Expansion needed cash, and cash in turn needed confidence. For that, the company kept two house magicians, Chief Financial Officer Fausto Tana and Auditor Grant Thornton's Italian affiliate. Their alchemy transformed debt into investment receivables, losses into goodwill, and promises into profit. Each quarter, Tana assembled a bouquet of numbers aromatic enough to satisfy analysts in Milan and New York. If revenue dipped, Parmalat's Cayman-based subsidiary Bonlat Financing wired a letter stating that $4 billion rested safely in a Bank of America account. The letter carried a familiar watermark and signature. No one phoned Nassau to confirm. A junior accountant once suggested a verification call, but Tana's eyebrows rose and the idea dissolved. In autumn 2003, a London hedge fund analyst named Jonathan Whedon flagged Parmalat's cash flow as too good to taste. The company reported colossal cash holdings yet paid interest rates reserved for firms starved of funds. Whedon drafted a 7-page note titled, "The Curious Case of Bonlat," circulating it quietly among short sellers. Meanwhile, Tanzi prepared for a televised press conference, promising to spin off the food division to unlock shareholder value. Cameras captured his steady hands, investors relaxed. Yet inside Parmalat's treasury, hands trembled. Currency derivatives, intended to hedge Brazilian real exposure, had swelled into speculative bets gone sour. Margin calls arrived like pounding rain on a tin roof. To plug holes, Tana issued Buoni Parmalat, domestic bonds hawked to Italian families who trusted the familiar blue and white logo. Pensioners lined post office counters to swap savings for 6% coupons and coupons for peace of mind. December 9th brought the first public crack. Deloitte and Touche, hired to replace Grant Thornton for the upcoming annual audit, requested direct confirmation of the famous $4 billion. Tana faxed over the usual letter. Deloitte phoned Bank of America's Milan branch. The banker replied tersely, "We have no record of that account." Headlines hit the wires before sunset. Parmalat shares, once as stable as a breakfast ritual, fell 40% in 2 days. Moody's slashed the credit rating to junk. Suppliers demanded cash on delivery. Supermarket shelves remained full, but orders for January evaporated. At midnight on December 17th, Tanzi convened a crisis council in a conference room overlooking the Parma River. He sat at the head of a long glass table, flanked by lawyers clutching bulging folders. Someone suggested selling the South American operations. Another proposed a government bailout. Tanzi listened, nodded, then whispered, "Che tempo, there is time." Yet outside, Carabinieri loaded boxes of invoices into unmarked vans. Fausto Tana, sensing the tide, visited prosecutors the following morning. Under fluorescent glare, he described a decade-long ballet of shell companies, false invoices for powdered milk that never crossed an ocean, and circular loans where Parmalat financed itself with its own IOUs. Asked about the $4 billion, he smiled weakly, un sogno. It is a dream. December 24th, Christmas Eve. The Tribunal of Parma declared Parmalat insolvent with a hole in its balance sheet approaching 14 billion euros, Europe's largest corporate failure to date. Streets once perfumed with warm ricotta filled instead with the metallic scent of disbelief. Employees opened email notices, salaries frozen, benefits in limbo. In grocery aisles, shoppers hesitated, eyeing the familiar cartons as if they might leak secrets. Tanzi was arrested 3 days later, shielded from flashbulbs by a gray overcoat. The judge read charges of fraudulent auditing, market manipulation, and criminal association. Tanzi murmured that he had only tried to protect una famiglia allargata, an extended family, meaning the 36,000 workers whose livelihoods depended on faith. He portrayed himself less as architect than caretaker who patched leaks until the dam burst. Trials stretched over years, knots of defendants crossing and recrossing court thresholds. Bankers accused of hiding side letters, auditors who missed red flags the size of billboards, lawyers who drafted bond prospectuses dense with euphemism. In 2008, Tanzi received a 10-year sentence. Appeals chiseled it down, but not to zero. Tana, contrite and weary, served less yet found no bank willing to hire him even as a clerk. Pensioners sued, class action funds dripped partial restitution. Supermarkets relabeled shelves with rival brands. Parmalat itself, shorn of debt by court-appointed administrator Enrico Bondi, survived. In a quiet irony, its underlying dairy business proved healthy once freed of financial acrobatics. The company was eventually acquired by France's Lactalis, the blue and white logo now under distant stewardship. Tanker trucks still roll across the Pavali at dawn, gathering milk that ends in cartons bearing a name both trusted and betrayed. On certain evenings, a warm breeze carries the smell of hay across Parma's cobblestones. Locals sip Lambrusco outside trattorias, conversation drifting to football, taxes, anything but the scandal. Yet a subtle caution lingers. When a businessman boasts of unstoppable growth, someone may raise an eyebrow, remembering the mirage conjured from powdered milk, phantom cash, and signatures no one bothered to dial. In that quiet pause lives the final legacy of Callisto Tanzi, proof that even the most wholesome facade can hide a silence deeper than any vat, waiting for one question, just one, to turn the milk sweetly, irrevocably sour. Night settled softly over Clinton, Mississippi, a town of magnolias and modest porches that still marveled at being headquarters to the nation's second-largest long-distance carrier. From his oak-paneled office, Bernard Evers, Bernie to admirers, could watch fireflies drift beyond the window while ticker symbols on his television whispered upward. A former high school basketball coach with a preacher's cadence, he had built WorldCom through fierce acquisition, swallowing MCI Brooks Fiber Unet until the company's revenue curve looked like a launch trajectory. Employees treated Evers' word as scripture. He strode the hallways in cowboy boots, greeting accountants by name, reminding them they were family. On quarterly calls he promised double-digit growth, double-digit discipline, and analysts nodded, pencils flying. Yet inside the financial planning group on the 5th floor, Betty Vincent stared at spreadsheets that refused to rise with identical grace. Line costs, the mundane fees WorldCom paid to connect calls over other networks, kept creeping higher. Revenue, pressured by dot-com collapse, no longer cooperated. The gap yawned like a sinkhole. CFO Scott Sullivan appeared one afternoon by Vincent's cubicle, tie loose, smile practiced. "We'll book it as a capital expenditure," he said softly, tapping the offending expense with a gold pen. CapEx, unlike operating costs, could be depreciated over years, smoothing earnings. "Just a bridge," he assured, "until synergies kick in." Vincent hesitated. She was good at journal entries, not rebellion. Eventually she recoded $771 million of routine line costs into property, plant, and equipment. The numbers now matched Evers' promise. Auditors saw nothing amiss. The bridge, however, became a highway. Each quarter brought fresh shortfalls masked as assets. Conduit fees, access charges, even software rentals. Everything routed to the balance sheet's quieter corner. Sullivan's inner circle called the maneuver the plug. Vincent and colleague Troy Norman signed off each time, wrestling private dread. At morning stand-ups, managers sipped sweet tea and celebrated another clean quarter. Across town, internal audit director Cynthia Cooper sensed something off-key. Late evenings she led a small team through deserted corridors, laptops glowing under motion sensor lights. They traced journal entries backward, discovering debits that ended in cul-de-sacs. No purchase orders, no vendor invoices, only a cryptic phrase, prepaid capacity. Cooper requested supporting documents, controllers stalled. Rumor reached Sullivan, who instructed IT to restrict her access. The harder doors closed, the surer she felt the secret was real. Meanwhile, Evers faced personal cash squeezes. He had borrowed hundreds of millions on margin to fund timberland and hotel ventures, pledging WorldCom shares as collateral. The stock slide threatened margin calls. He ordered an aggressive share buyback to buoy the price, draining corporate cash. Still, at town hall meetings he spoke of faith, reciting Corinthians about running the race set before us. Employees cheered, some wiping appreciative tears. Spring 2002 arrived heavy with humidity and suspicion. Cooper's team, now working nights to avoid detection, printed ledger trails that wound like kudzu. One entry capitalized $900 million of line costs with a single keystroke. She carried the stack to the audit committee chair, former SEC Chief William McLucas, who advised immediate outside counsel. When Sullivan learned of the move, he summoned Vincent and Normand. "If this falls apart," he warned, voice flat, "people will lose jobs." The accountants returned to their desks feeling smaller than their swivel chairs. June 20th, WorldCom's board convened an emergency teleconference. Sullivan admitted the reclassifications, framing them as interpretive. McLucas pressed. The figure ballooned, $3.8 billion over 5 quarters. Silence pooled on the line, only faint feedback echoed, like breath in a long-distance handset. The directors voted to notify regulators before dawn. 2 nights later, Ebers's portrait still hung in the lobby, but security badges for Sullivan and his deputies deactivated with a quiet click. Vincent drove home past soybean fields, radio reporting SEC subpoenas, and wondered how long before her own phone rang. In Washington, SEC Chairman Harvey Pitt labeled the fraud one of the largest in history, a phrase soon overtaken by larger numbers. The restatement swelled past $11 billion. July 21, 2002. At 1:30 a.m., WorldCom filed for Chapter 11 protection. The news scrolled across cable screens in muted blues. Exhausted employees watched from couches bought on stock option dreams. Pension funds hemorrhaged, local diners fretted over tips. Clinton's water tower, freshly painted with the company logo, now loomed like an inside joke. Trials unfolded under fluorescent courtroom light. Sullivan pleaded guilty, testifying that Ebers demanded targets no business could meet honestly. Ebers took the stand in his own defense, voice still soothing, declaring ignorance of accounting minutiae. Jurors heard tapes of earnings calls against spreadsheets showing hidden gaps. The contrast rang louder than any sermon. Guilty on 9 counts, Ebers received 25 years, Sullivan 5 reduced to serve 13. Vincent, trembling, addressed the judge. "I didn't feel I had a choice," she said, receiving probation, gratitude for her belated candor. WorldCom emerged from bankruptcy as MCI, then faded into Verizon's shadow. The Clinton campus stands half-occupied, its once brisk hallways echoing with the hum of aging HVAC units. At sunset, magnolia petals fall onto cracked pavement where employees once parked SUVs proudly bearing company decals. Cynthia Cooper published a memoir, lecturing on courage. In classrooms, she holds up a single ledger page stamped with prepaid capacity and asks students where they would draw the line. Some stare, some shrug, but a few pause, imagining the soft Mississippi night, the urge to please, and the cost of one quiet keystroke that turned empty lines into the emptiest promise of all. Salt winds swept across Copenhagen's harbor, rattling the halyards of moored yachts as dusk settled over Holman's Canal. Inside Danske Bank's limestone headquarters, polished floors mirrored the pendant lamps, and footsteps of late-night analysts clicked like metronomes. From a glass office on the 7th floor, Howard Wilkinson, head of trading for the Baltic region, studied an Excel sheet that refused to obey gravity. Wire transfers from an Estonian branch piled upward in columns marked non-resident flow. In 2 months the total topped €3 billion. Wilkinson rubbed his temple. No Danish dairy exporter moved money like that. Across the Øresund Bridge, Tallinn's Narva Manti branch pulsed with another rhythm. The lobby smelled of fresh varnish and coffee ground strong enough to wake the stone walls of Old Town. Bankers there greeted clients whose passports bore stamps from Azerbaijan, Russia, Moldova. They opened shell company accounts for consultancy, machinery trade, flour export. Compliance forms arrived pre-checked, source of funds boxes declaring inheritance in identical script. Branch manager Ivar Rihi, urbane and brisk, assured headquarters that the surge reflected Estonia's growing role as a gateway between East and West. Bonuses followed, as punctual as sunrise. In 2013, Wilkinson sent the first red flag memo to Copenhagen. Volumes abnormal, counterparties opaque, risk of laundering significant. The reply, polite and corporate, cited strategic importance of non-resident clients and urged continued vigilance. Months later, another memo outlined suspicious patterns. multiple accounts receiving identical dollar figures within minutes, always rounded to the nearest thousand, then vanishing into British limited partnerships with no employees. Silence answered. Wilkinson printed his emails, slipped them into a manila folder, and slid the folder inside a drawer he began locking at night. Meanwhile, Prague-based reporter Pavla Halkova scanned a leaked database of offshore entities for a separate investigation. She noticed that dozens of companies funneled millions through the same Tallinn BIC code, .detel. She highlighted the rows, saved the file, and flagged them possible laundromat. A pattern formed. Money left eastern state budgets via inflated procurement contracts, moved through Dansk Estonia, and emerged in London real estate or Swiss art auctions, cleansed, untraceable. Halkova pitched the story to editors. They shrugged. Without documents tying the loop, it felt vaporous. Back in Copenhagen, Dansk's new chief compliance officer, an American named Bill Browder, convened a risk committee that finally authorized an internal review. Consultants from Brun and Jegel arrived with clipboards and cautious smiles, interviewing clerks who suddenly remembered vacations booked months ago. Computer forensics traced IP addresses. Many Estonian clients logged in daily from Moscow hotels. A line in one report read, estimated suspicious flow 2007 to 2015, 200 billion euros. The number struck like a dropped anchor, almost equivalent to Estonia's annual GDP, multiplied 6 times. The board gathered on a rainy September morning in 2018, windows streaked like watercolors. CEO Thomas Borgen, gray-haired and unflappable, presented the findings. Directors stared as if he had read aloud a foreign language. One asked, could these figures be transposed? Borgen shook his head. Outside, umbrellas bobbed past the bronze statue of Niels Jewel. Inside, the room chilled by degrees. The chairwoman cleared her throat and announced Borgen's resignation, for the good of the bank. News broke before lunch. Euro 200 billion laundered through Danske Bank. Markets recoiled. Crowds of commuters on Vesterport station platforms leaned into glowing phone screens. Some gasped, others smirked at Danish self-righteousness dented. In Tallinn, police lights flickered outside Narva Manti. Files were hauled out in plastic crates, their spines labeled in Cyrillic. Branch manager Rihi disappeared into forest-edged silence, found weeks later by a jogger on the Vosa riverbank, an apparent suicide that left investigators with more questions than notes. In Washington, the U.S. Treasury's FinCEN drafted a notice considering Dansk of primary money laundering concern, a phrase capable of severing dollar clearing. Danish regulators, once content with gentle admonitions, now threatened revocation of the bank's license. Journalists descended on Hallman's Canal, counting shutter clicks like heartbeats. Wilkinson, coaxed by parliamentary summons, laid out his memos. Lawmakers listened, brows knotted, while he described a compliance culture where warnings evaporated and profits overrode prudence. His British accent cut through the Danish hum like a compass needle finding north. Courtrooms across Europe filled with echoes of bankers claiming ignorance. Prosecutors displayed spreadsheets mapping flows from Russian tax fraud cases, Azerbaijani slush funds, even proceeds of North Korean arms sales, each washing through the same Estonian canal. Defense attorneys argued that Know Your Customer rules were less mature in the late 2000s, that local regulators had signed off. Judges asked why alarm bells from Copenhagen rang so softly, why bonuses for Tallinn staff doubled in laundering's peak years. No one produced a convincing map of conscience. Danske allotted billions for fines, slashed dividends, shut its Estonian operations overnight. Empty desks collected dust. The sign outside Narva Manti came down at dawn, leaving faint blue shadows against beige stone. Shareholders filed suits. Pensioners recalculated retirements. Danish politicians pledged the toughest anti-laundering laws in Europe. Halkova's newsroom finally ran her story, a sprawling exposé titled The Baltic Laundry, data visualizations glowing like constellations across screen scrolls. Wilkinson resigned and moved to a cottage in Yorkshire, tending apiaries, the whir of bees less complicated than cross-border finance. Occasionally he lectures at universities, bringing the manila folder, now dog-eared. He asks students to spot the red flags. Most do within minutes. After class he walks alone along hedgerows, wondering how a global bank missed what young eyes see at a glance. At night, Copenhagen's harbor still gleams, reflections rippling in black water. Tourists sip cider on repurposed wharf cafes, unaware of the subterranean current that once carried fortunes beneath their feet. Somewhere, art purchased with washed funds hangs in a London penthouse, its provenance as polished as the marble lobby below. Yet in a filing cabinet at Denmark's Financial Supervisory Authority lies a final internal email, a single line from a junior analyst. If we do not close the Estonian flow, it will close us. The line came too late, or perhaps right on time, because now, whenever Scandinavian bankers hear the phrase non-resident clients, they pause, and in that hesitation lingers the faint, persistent echo of the Baltic laundromat. Palo Alto's dawn light filtered through redwood branches, painting faint bars across the glass facade of 1701 Page Mill Road. Inside, Thermia, Theranos headquarters, hummed with refrigerated centrifuges and the muted chatter of engineers in fleece vests. Elizabeth Holmes, tall in her black turtleneck, stepped onto the carpet like a conductor approaching a silent orchestra. Her blue eyes held a glimmer that could pass for conviction or hunger. Most people mistook one for the other. Holmes had promised a revolution, a single finger prick of blood yielding hundreds of lab results in minutes. She spoke of eliminating diagnostic pain the way others spoke of abolishing smallpox. Venture capitalists, seduced by a Silicon Valley metaphor, medicine as an iPhone app, wrote 9-digit checks without ever lifting a pipette. Walgreens executives pictured kiosks beside greeting cards. The U.S. Department of Defense imagined battlefield medics armed with portable analyzers. The future smelled faintly of antiseptic and money. Deep in the undisclosed location lab, the Edison device told a different tale. Engineers nicknamed it Frankenstein for its rattling armatures and temperamental optical reader. Reagents spoiled, microfluidic cartridges jammed, and control data swung wider than California's diurnal range. Yet each time an error light flashed red, Holmes insisted it was merely a calibration hiccup. She ordered more black curtains around workstations, citing trade secret containment, and tightened leak tracking badges on visitors like hospital bracelets. Sunny Balwani, president, mentor, and shadow, managed operations with an intensity that bordered on menace. He measured loyalty in milliseconds. An email unanswered after 10 minutes drew a tap on one's shoulder. When chemist Erica Chung flagged abnormal potassium readings that could trigger false cardiac alarms, Balwani told her, "If you don't have the right mindset, you don't belong in a startup." She pocketed her badge, drove home through the eucalyptus-scented dusk, and drafted a resignation letter that night. Across the bay in San Francisco, Wall Street Journal reporter John Carreyrou noted a small lawsuit between Theranos and a former partner. Court filings hinted that the company used standard Siemens machines for most tests while claiming results came from proprietary tech. He circled the clue like a hawk. A retired lab director, Alan Beam, a pseudonym at first, agreed to meet in a cafe whose whirring espresso machine drowned paranoia. Beam described diluted samples, voided runs, and a culture where dissent equated to betrayal. Carreyrou's notebook filled with arrows connecting buzzwords to biohazards. Back at headquarters, Holmes rehearsed for a Forbes summit. She practiced phrases, clinical landscape, democratizing health, in a low register that had become her signature. An assistant printed the latest proficiency report showing Theranos ranked near the bottom among certified labs. Holmes slipped the pages into a drawer, locked it, and adjusted the volume of the ambient music piping through Bose speakers. Something upbeat, almost defiant. The journal's first expose landed on October 15, 2015. Headlines accused Theranos of concealing erratic data and misusing commercial analyzers. Investors blinked but held their ground. Charisma sometimes outruns scrutiny. Holmes appeared on CNBC, eyes unwavering, declaring, "This is what happens when you threaten entrenched interests." She promised full transparency after an internal review. Balwani sent an all-hands email, "Loose talk ends now." Pathologist Adam Rosendorf, haunted by images of patients making medical decisions on faulty numbers, contacted regulators. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, dispatched inspectors to the company's Newark, California lab. They found unqualified staff calibrating assays, temperature logs backfilled in identical ink, and a control chart altered with correction fluid. The paper literally bled white. In January 2016, CMS issued a scathing letter citing conditions that posed immediate jeopardy to patient health. Holmes read the phrase aloud in the boardroom, syllables thick as syrup, then declared, "We will fix this." Yet the foundation had already cracked. Walgreens froze its partnership. Safeway quietly wrote down a $350 million investment in unused clinic space. Venture funds updated slide decks, moving Theranos from unicorn to contingent liability. Balwani paced hallways now emptier, his footfalls echoing. Engineers boxed prototypes. Compliance officers shredded old calibration sheets under posters still promising one drop, 4 hours, 240 tests. June 2018 brought federal indictments. 11 counts of wire fraud and conspiracy. Prosecutors painted Holmes and Balwani as co-architects of a multi-million-dollar scheme to defraud investors and patients. In court, Holmes arrived clutching a blue notebook, her turtleneck swapped for a pale blazer that softened her silhouette but not her resolve. Prosecutors played clips of her TED Talk next to lab emails pleading for reagent stability. The dissonance rang like a cracked bell. Jurors watched former patients testify, a mother misled about thyroid levels, a man convinced his prostate cancer had returned. Holmes's defense argued good faith, iterative development, not deception. But the evidence felt granular and unyielding. Excel files falsified for Pfizer, validation reports overwritten minutes before being emailed to Walgreens, internal memos labeling faulty runs as customer ready. After 7 days of deliberation, the verdict arrived. Guilty on 4 counts of investor fraud, hung on patient-facing charges, acquittal on a handful. The judge set sentencing for the fall. Outside, cameras clicked like hail against glass. Holmes maintained her calm. She spoke of continuing to work on healthcare solutions. Yet as she stepped into a waiting SUV, the redwood shadows cast bars across her figure, reminiscent of something less metaphorical. Theranos dissolved, assets auctioned. Microscopes to community colleges, office chairs to tech startups chasing different miracles. The once hushed lab site turned into a biotech incubator where new founders pass a bronze plaque quoting Hippocrates. First, do no harm. They glance at the words, then at the news clipping collage framed on the lobby wall, Theranos headlines arching from euphoria to echo. On quiet afternoons, Kariru revisits his notes, each page still faintly smelling of cafe espresso. Erica Chung lectures at ethics seminars, holding up a miniature vial containing exactly 20 microliters of red-tinted water. She asks students if they believe this drop can reveal their future. Most smile, some nod, and a few hesitate, that fragile moment where skepticism is born. And somewhere in Palo Alto, the redwoods remain indifferent, rings widening imperceptibly each year. Above their canopy, promises continue to rise like morning fog, ambitious, weightless, shimmering, until eyes sharpen, questions harden, and the scarlet drop meets the cool mirror of doubt. Claire Wexler's corner office looked like a glacier suspended above lower Manhattan. All glass angles, pale leather, and the faint hum of an air handling system tuned to museum silence. She was 43, impeccably groomed and calm to the point of opacity, perfect qualities for a chief financial officer at Midtown Children's Health Fund, a celebrated nonprofit that raised nearly $100 million a year. Donors loved the transparency of the organization. Auditors rarely found a misplaced cent. Anne Claire, who had arrived from Goldman Sachs with glowing references, was the reassuring figurehead of that accountability. She hardly ever raised her voice, but her signature, small, looping, a touch whimsical, released millions of dollars at a time for mobile clinics and pediatric research. No one imagined that the pen which promised relief to sick children could, with the same flourish, siphon away their hope. The first shadow passed over Claire's reputation on a sticky July afternoon when a junior accountant named Miguel Rojas stared too long at a routine spreadsheet. A line item labeled Community Outreach Consulting consumed exactly $200,000 every quarter, yet no corresponding services appeared in program reports. Miguel asked his supervisor, who shrugged, consultants bill differently, maybe they rolled invoices together, and told him not to worry. But Miguel remembered a lecture from his ethics professor. Round numbers are rarely real numbers. That night, he reopened the file at home, tracing payments to an LLC registered in Delaware under the name Corelia Partners. The corporate address was a co-working space, the telephone led to a voicemail, and the website consisted of a single page that said simply, Strategic Impact, Amplified. Miguel felt the first chill of dread. He printed the statements and placed them in an envelope he intended to drop anonymously on the desk of the external auditors in September. Weeks slipped by. The city baked beneath heat advisories, and Midtown Children's hosted its annual gala at the Plaza Hotel. Cameras flashed, champagne flowed, and Claire drifted from table to table in an emerald silk gown, thanking hedge fund titans for their generosity. Midway through the evening, she slipped into a service corridor to take a call. Her voice, normally uninflected, now sharpened. "You cannot send wire instructions from your personal account. It has to look ordinary. I'll forward the template. And for God's sake, stop texting. Use Signal and delete everything." Returning to the ballroom, she found Miguel stationed near the silent auction, tie crooked, cheeks flushed with cheap wine. She smiled, so gentle it bordered on maternal, and asked if he was enjoying the night. Miguel nodded. He thought of the envelope still hidden in his apartment and felt suddenly foolish. The woman before him radiated sincerity. He decided to sleep on it. Autumn arrived, bringing with it the external audit. Claire greeted the accountants like old friends, offering black coffee, detailed schedules, and the use of a glass-walled conference room. She sat with them for hours, explaining variances, quoting footnotes from memory. The round-numbered consulting fees went unchallenged. Claire produced signed contracts, neatly itemized deliverables, and an email chain that appeared to confirm work performed. The auditors ticked their boxes, impressed by the CFO who seemed to know every ledger by heart. Miguel watched from a distance, the envelope still in his desk drawer, sealed like a confession he could not bring himself to utter. He told himself he must have misread the data. The auditors were professionals. If they saw no problem, why should he? Yet the smallest fissure can spread. A donor in Zurich requested a site visit to observe Carelia's outreach program. The development director, baffled, asked Claire for an itinerary. Claire replied that Carelia's work was largely back office, and not conducive to tours. Unsatisfied, the donor delayed a planned $7 million pledge. That hesitation rippled through the board. Suddenly, questions crystallized. Why were consulting costs up 20% year over year while program spending remained flat? Why did Carelia's invoices bear no staff names, no travel receipts, no logos? Claire deflected with poised charm, promising a full briefing, but her voice slipped once, just a fraction of a note too high, and the room held its breath. Pressure exposes fractures. One December morning, while Claire attended a budget meeting, IT support received an urgent request to restore emails she claimed had vanished after an iPad crash. Protocol required a mirrored backup. The technician, methodical and incurious, copied her mailbox to an encrypted drive. Over lunch, he noticed a folder labeled Licorice, filled with PDF invoices identical in format to Carelia's, but billed instead to an entity called Alder Row Ventures. Same amounts, same dates, different bank. He mentioned it casually to his manager, who mentioned it to the general counsel, who quietly called an emergency board session. Claire sensed the storm 30 minutes before it hit. A sudden hush in corridors, doors closing too softly, colleagues avoiding her gaze, signatures of imminent rupture. She considered fleeing, rehearsed a story about stress and early retirement, even pictured herself on a white beach, but the fantasy evaporated when two board members entered her office with the counsel and asked her to accompany them. In the glass conference room, she saw Miguel, pale and rigid, clutching the envelope he had finally surrendered. On the table lay statements tracing $18.4 million through a braid of shell companies to an account in the Cayman Islands held in the name of her college roommate. Someone had printed a color photo of a beachfront condo deeded to the same shell. Claire's gaze lingered on the turquoise water in the picture. Then, with the same gentle composure she used when signing grants, she folded her hands and said, "You'll want my lawyer." The aftermath unfolded slowly, like the settling of dust after an implosion. Newspapers ran front-page exposés about the charity that robbed the sick, accompanied by Claire's yearbook photo and the inevitable headline quoting her college nickname, Ice Queen. Donors withdrew, programs shuttered, and trust, once Midtown Children's greatest asset, vanished into the same void that had swallowed the money. Miguel resigned, unable to endure the echoing hallways and the parents who still arrived begging for help. He kept a single memento, the gala invitation where Claire had first smiled at him, as a reminder that evil often wears the calmest face. And in a federal courtroom 6 months later, as Claire stood to be sentenced, he heard her voice at last crack. Not for the children, not for the staff she betrayed, but for the life of glass and quiet she would never inhabit again. The equity derivatives floor of Société Générale felt more like a hushed chapel than a trading pit. Rows of curved monitors glowed with pastel graphs, and the only sounds were the faint whir of cooling fans and the occasional clink of an espresso cup against tempered glass. To the bank's senior dealers, it was a realm of controlled aggression. One miskeyed order could knock billions from market value. Yet in January 2007, a junior arbitrageur named Jérôme Kerviel, sandy-haired and soft-spoken, moved through the room like vapor, almost invisible and therefore unthreatening. He had risen from the middle back office, memorized every clearance rule, and quietly learned which checks could be overridden without triggering alarms. Those rules, intended to keep traders honest, became the scaffolding of his secret kingdom. The first position he hid was small, 40 million euros on the DAX futures curve. He fabricated an equal and opposite hedge that existed only in the bank's confirmation system, balanced in theory but non-existent in reality. Risk management saw a matched pair and relaxed. No net exposure, no problem. Kerviel watched the numbers flicker, felt a flush of power, and closed the trade for a 40,000 euro gain, half of his annual salary in a single afternoon. That success tasted like citrus on the back of his tongue, bittersweet and impossible to forget. At night he walked the banks of the Seine, headphones playing muted electronica, cigarette smoke curling into the winter air. His mother still believed he worked sane hours. His friends thought he was merely diligent. Inside, a different clock ticked. If he could hide 10 lots, why not 100? If he could square trades with phantom hedges, why not create entire portfolios? The belief settled over him like a warm coat. He was not stealing, merely front-running his colleagues by a beat or two, exploiting tiny cracks in the system, cracks he himself had helped plaster when he worked in compliance. He told himself the bank would thank him when the profits appeared. Spring brought volatility and opportunity. Kerviel's positions, now in the multi-billion euro range, dwarfed those of traders twice his rank. Each morning he arrived before dawn to cancel the fictional hedges, exposing the real bets just long enough to see overnight P&L, then reintroduced new fakes before the control teams logged in. The maneuver took 13 minutes. He timed it with the discipline of a watchmaker. Managers glanced at reports showing modest exposures. Kerviel alone could see the true mountain of risk rising behind the numbers. The thrill became physical, a quickening pulse, a tremor in his fingers, and he lived for it. One June afternoon the futures desk erupted in applause. Kerviel had booked 150 million euros, more than any trader in the division. The head of equities shook his hand, murmuring, "Exceptional," and ordered champagne flutes from the executive pantry. Kerviel's grin was oddly desperate. He had earned the money, yes, but he also knew that recognition invited scrutiny. Applause had a half-life. Tomorrow compliance might wonder how a mid-level dealer generated hedge fund-sized gains. That night, in a cramped studio overlooking Gare Saint-Lazare, he deleted an entire batch of false offsetting trades and built another, more complex web to cover the celebratory spike. Sleep came in 20-minute fragments, each dream a margin call. The first hairline crack appeared in November. A risk control analyst named Laure Dupont noticed that a single user ID canceled and re-entered large trades at unusual hours. She sent a polite query, but Kerviel intercepted the email, masqueraded as back office, and replied that the pattern was a routine compression exercise. Laure, new to the bank, accepted the explanation but flagged the account for follow-up in the new year. Kerviel understood the reprieve was temporary. Markets were shifting. The subprime tremors in the United States began to rattle European indices, and his hidden positions, net long 21 billion euros, could no longer be hedged by imagination. January 18, 2008, dawned leaden and cold. Overnight futures plunged on rumors of an American insurer's collapse. Kerviel's screens bled red. He toggled through Excel sheets, seeking a path to neutral, but every click widened the hole. Losses passed 2 billion, then 4. His face remained expressionless, yet beneath the desk his right knee bounced like a metronome. At 10:12 a.m. he walked to his supervisor's glass cubicle and spoke 8 quiet words. "There is something you need to see." By evening the bank's crisis cell gathered in a subterranean war room. Compliance officers, auditors, and lawyers sat shoulder to shoulder staring at flowcharts that now seemed absurd. One junior trader, acting alone, had amassed exposure equal to the GDP of a small nation. Daniel Boughton, the CEO, rubbed his temples and whispered, "Say impossible," as if repetition might bend reality. Across the table, Kerviel answered each question in a calm monotone, neither defensive nor contrite. He described the loopholes, the ignored warnings, the applause that encouraged risk, and the quiet permission everyone gave by not asking hard questions. It was, he said, a game the system taught me to play. Over the weekend, Societe Generale unwound the positions at a staggering loss of 6.3 billion euros. Newspapers called it the biggest trading scandal in European history. Politicians demanded safeguards, rivals sneered, and shareholders filed lawsuits. Kerviel's colleagues emptied their desks at night, avoiding cameras. Laure Dupont stared at her original flagged email, wondering why she had waited. Trust, she realized, doesn't collapse like a tower. It erodes, grain by grain, until the whole facade slides into the river. Kerviel was arrested at dawn on Monday, rain drumming on the hood of his parka as plainclothes officers led him to an unmarked car. Outside, the Palais de Justice photographers shouted his name, flashes cracking like distant thunder. He looked almost relieved. Behind him, the Grand Bank spun its story, a lone rogue, a statistical anomaly. But in the quiet of a holding cell, Kerviel whispered to his lawyer, "I only pushed where everything was already hollow." The words hung in the stale air, a confession and an indictment of the machinery that had made him both invisible and indispensable, until the moment he wasn't. No one would have guessed that Germany's flashiest tech hope resided in a squat, beige building on the edge of Askium, a sleepy suburb east of Munich. The sign out front, Wirecard AG, gleamed in tempered steel, but inside the headquarters the corridors felt almost provincial. Plain carpet, fluorescent lighting, and the faint smell of reheated espresso. Markus Braun, the bespectacled Austrian who served as chief executive, liked it that way. The modest setting contrasted with his grand pronouncements about a cashless future and suggested frugality to investors hungry for the next European unicorn. They believed him because the numbers in Wirecard's annual reports sang a song of perpetual ascent, transaction volumes soaring, profits doubling, margins defying gravity. Everyone admired the tune. Almost no one asked whether the orchestra existed. The first tremor came in February 2016, when a London analyst noticed that Wirecard's Asian subsidiaries booked outsized profits yet occupied little more than serviced offices rented by the month. He published a skeptical note. Braun dismissed it as market manipulation, and the company's legal team unleashed cease and desist letters with the force of a monsoon. Shareholders rallied to the flag. The stock price dipped, then climbed higher, and the analyst learned that challenging a market darling can feel like shouting into a jet engine. Inside Wirecard, employees whispered that the Asian profit centers were third-party acquiring partners, a phrase repeated so often it acquired a talismanic glow, warding off further questions. Jan Marsalek, the boyish chief operating officer with an unsettling memory for detail, presided over those partners. He visited Singapore, Manila, and Dubai with the composure of a diplomat, returning to Munich with binders full of contracts and a grin that suggested he had glimpsed the future. He kept no permanent home, just a series of hotel suites and a rotating cast of bodyguards, but everyone agreed he was indispensable. If Braun was the scholar visionary, Marsalek was the rainmaker, conjuring revenue where none had existed before. When journalists pressed for specifics, names, addresses, audited accounts, he chuckled softly and spoke of proprietary networks and regulatory sensitivities. The vagueness felt almost luxurious, like the fog that hides the imperfections of a famous monument. By 2018, Wirecard had entered Germany's blue-chip DAX index, displacing Commerzbank and heralding the triumph of fintech over old-world finance. Pension funds poured in. Politicians praised the company as proof that Europe could still compete with Silicon Valley. At an investor conference in Frankfurt, Braun stood beneath pulsating LED screens and predicted €1 billion profit within 3 years. He wore his usual black turtleneck, part Jobsian homage, part armor, and flicked through slides showing hockey stick curves. Away from the stage, an English reporter named Dan McCrum watched closely. He had spent months collecting rumors from disgruntled ex-employees who spoke of forged contracts and missing cash. McCrum suspected a fraud so large that it bent reality around it. Yet each article he published triggered immediate denials, legal threats, and even a brief police investigation, into him, not the company. Summer tipped into autumn and the pressure inside Wirecard thickened. In Singapore, an internal accountant found invoices dated on public holidays, stamped by suppliers that shared post office boxes with Wirecard's own office. She escalated the findings, only to be told that Asian cultures handled paperwork differently. When she persisted, a compliance manager suggested she take stress leave. Instead, she copied the files to a thumb drive sealed in a plastic envelope and slipped it into a safe deposit box. The quiet revolt had begun. Early in 2019, KPMG was hired for a special audit to silence critics once and for all. Braun assured the market it would be routine, but behind closed doors Marsalek struggled to locate bank statements for two trustee accounts said to hold €1.9 billion on behalf of the Asian partners. Emails flew across time zones, increasingly frantic. A Philippine banker explained, in broken syntax, that the partners' documents were in process. When KPMG requested direct confirmation, PDF letters appeared, bearing mismatched fonts and the signature of a manager who no longer worked at the bank. The auditors hesitated, sniffed the paper, and finally asked to phone the branch. The line rang into oblivion. April 2020 arrived with a global pandemic and a deadline KPMG refused to extend. Their report landed like a mallet. They could not verify that the €1.9 billion existed. Wirecard's board convened at dawn in a sterile conference room where the air felt 2 degrees too warm. Braun tapped a pen against his knuckles while Marsalek, usually voluble, stared at the wall clock as if willing it to reverse. At 7:12 a.m. the company announced a postponement of its annual accounts. By lunchtime, the share price had lost half its value. Television crews set up outside headquarters, lenses trained on the revolving doors. On June 18, the final blow struck. 2 Philippine banks declared the trustee letters forgeries. The cash had never entered their systems. The €1.9 billion was a phantom. Braun resigned 10 hours later, issuing a terse statement about accounting irregularities. Marsalek vanished entirely, last seen boarding a private jet from Innsbruck under a false name. Rumors placed him in Minsk, Moscow, maybe Beirut, moving through the shadow world he had always inhabited. Interpol issued a red notice. The man himself became another ghost entry, like the funds he once cited so confidently. In a Munich jail cell, Braun awaited trial, calm behind wire-rimmed glasses. He told prosecutors that he, too, had been deceived, that if the money did not exist it must have existed once. Across town, former employees updated resumes scrubbed of the Wirecard logo. Investors filed class actions. Politicians held hearings, scolding regulators who had protected the company while attacking its critics. Trust, that invisible currency, lay in shards on the committee table. The beige building in Askium now stands half empty, lights flickering at dusk. A security guard makes hourly rounds past stacks of abandoned marketing brochures proclaiming real money, real time. Only the slogan remains, echoing in a corridor where the future once seemed certain. In truth, the future had been borrowed, conjured from Photoshop and bravado, until the day the ledger demanded repayment in reality's harsh, unforgiving currency. Dixon, Illinois, calls itself the Petunia capital of the world, a river town where church bells still mark the passing hours and the city budget is scarcely larger than a Midwestern high school's. For more than 2 decades, residents believed their prosperity, freshly paved streets, tidy parks, a sparkling annual fireworks display, was shepherded by Rita Crundwell, the quietly efficient comptroller who joined City Hall straight out of high school in 1970. She favored beige cardigans, spoke in a hushed mezzo, and arrived at her desk each dawn with a thermos of black coffee. No one suspected that, behind her neat ledger columns, she was rewriting the town's history, one wire transfer at a time. Rita's official salary never exceeded $80,000, yet locals whispered about her other life. The palatial horse farm on Red Brick Road, the fleet of silver show trailers, the gleaming quarter horses that bore her initials on custom saddle blankets. She traveled to competitions in Florida and Texas, returning with ribbons the color of midsummer corn. Photographs of her smiling beneath a 10-gallon hat appeared in equestrian magazines. They dubbed her the Queen of Quarter Horses. She framed the spreads and hung them beside City Hall certificates. Nobody connected the two worlds. After all, Dixon wanted heroes, and Rita seemed to have found that rare alchemy of hobby and civic duty. The first thread unraveled on a drizzly afternoon in October 2011. Kathy Swanson, filling in while Rita vacationed at the All-American Quarter Horse Congress, needed bank statements to reconcile routine bills. She logged into the city's accounts and noticed an unfamiliar name, RSCDA Reserve Fund, a checking account that moved 6 figures at a time. Its mailing address matched City Hall's, yet it had never appeared on published budgets. Kathy asked the bank to fax signature cards. The authorization box contained Rita's looping pen strokes. Something knotted in her stomach. Still, she printed the statements, stapled them, and left them on the city clerk's desk, unsure whether she had discovered a typo or a tunnel. City Clerk Ginny Cummings phoned Mayor Jim Burke the next morning, voice tight. Burke had known Rita since she babysat his niece. Even so, the numbers looked wrong. Together they rang the FBI's Rockford office, careful to keep their voices low. In a small town, secrets echo. 2 agents arrived undercover, wearing ball caps and asking directions to the riverfront to explain their presence. In a borrowed office they studied the reserve fund, and the transfers leaping from it into a personal account titled RC Polo. The sums were staggering, $48 million since 1990, moving in increments as casual as grocery runs. The investigation unfolded in silence. Agents traced Rita's life of 2-lane highways and luxury auctions, the motorhome with marble countertops, the $2 million stallion named Good Eye Will Be, the downtown apartment in Chicago with a view of Lake Michigan's gray expanse. Each purchase had been paid in full, often by wire on the same day a city fund was drained. The scale of the embezzlement felt surreal. Dixon's entire annual budget barely crossed $8 million, yet Rita had siphoned off more than 6 times that without raising alarms. It was not merely theft, it was an invisible dam redirecting the town's economic river. April 17, 2012, dawned cool and bright. Rita drove her pickup to City Hall after a triumphant show in Wisconsin where her mare won grand champion. She set her hat on the passenger seat, smoothed her blouse, and entered the hallway lined with community photos. Inside her cramped office agents waited, badges clipped to belts instead of lapels so no one passing would see the gleam. They greeted her politely, asked her to sit, and presented a single-page complaint. Rita read it once, twice, lips pursed as if tasting a foreign spice. Then she whispered, "I might need to call someone." The arrest was gentle. No handcuffs in front of staff, only a quiet escort to a waiting sedan while the receptionist stared at her monitor, pretending not to notice. News rippled through Dixon with the force of a flash flood. Residents gathered at the KSB Cafe, pie fork suspended mid-air, replaying numbers they could scarcely grasp. $53 million gone, streets repaved only when potholes grew crater deep, a swimming pool long promised but never funded. They recalled bake sales for new library books and teachers buying supplies from their own pockets. Trust evaporated like morning fog. Dixon was not Wall Street. This was betrayal at handshake range. Federal prosecutors built their case on ledgers already meticulous, Rita's own. She had documented each theft with accountant's precision, creating fictitious invoices for capital improvement, and depositing the checks into her secret fund. During testimony, an agent observed that her fraud was elegant in its simplicity. At sentencing, Rita, dressed in a plain gray suit, spoke softly. She was sorry she loved Dixon, she never meant harm. The judge replied that greed dressed as ambition still corrodes. He imposed 19 years and 7 months in federal prison. Dixon residents filled 2 rows of benches. Some wept, some simply stared at the woman they once trusted with every streetlight's glow. The government auctioned Rita's empire. 400 horses, trailers gleaming under auction house fluorescents, embroidered blankets folded like flags. The proceeds, $9.2 million, returned to the city, a down payment against the yawning deficit. Slowly, sidewalks were repaired, squad cars replaced, the community pool finally broke ground. Yet the town's ledger now included an unquantifiable loss. The knowledge that fraud does not always wear sharp suits or speak in coastal accents. Sometimes it brings homemade cookies to council meetings and sponsors little league teams. On quiet evenings, the empty paddocks along red brick road shimmer in sunset, grass waving where champion horses once cantered. A lone mailbox still bears the initials RC, paint flaking, a relic of ambition turned poison. Drivers slow, glance, then accelerate, unable to decide whether the scene is a warning or merely a memory they wish would fade. Wall Street never truly sleeps. Yet at 3:07 a.m. its hum changes. In the hushed corridors of the Galleon Group's Midtown office, only two desks still glow. The security guard station near the elevators and the corner suite where Raj Rajaratnam studies a web of spreadsheets as intricate as a night sky. The billionaire hedge fund manager, thick-set and soft-spoken, claims to rely on fundamentals. Still, insiders know the real heart of his empire is information, precise, early, and private. Tonight the futures tick upward on news no journalist has yet printed. Raj smiles, pockets his phone, and decides to sleep an hour before the opening bell. Across the river in Hoboken, a junior chip analyst named Danielle Choi jolts awake to the same vibration. Her phone screen shows a single line from Raj's trusted lieutenant, Adam Smith. "Call me." Quiet line. Danielle, 27, Harvard Summa, tells friends she joined Galleon for the challenge. The real draw is the gravity well around Raj, the sense that proximity to him bends markets, careers, maybe even fate. She pads to the kitchen, dials a prepaid number, and hears Adam's calm tenor. "Texas Instruments sales are soft. Board meeting confirmed a guidance cut. Keep this to yourself. Load up on puts at the open." Danielle's pulse quickens. She whispers thanks and hangs up. Somewhere between ethics lecture halls and her Manhattan paycheck, the line between research and wrongdoing has blurred to translucence. Morning's first light reveals none of this. CNBC panels cheer Galleon's data-driven conviction. Raj walks the trading floor handing out saffron muffins, paternal, unhurried. At 9:17 a.m. Danielle submits an options order large enough to raise eyebrows at rival desks but small enough to slide under the exchange's alert thresholds. By lunchtime, a rumor about weak semiconductor demand surfaces on a niche blog, and the stock dips 2%. Casualties look random. Only those wired into the Whisper network understand the choreography. The network is Raj's masterpiece, stitched from former classmates, golf partners, and bar-side acquaintances who hold mid-level jobs inside America's most secretive boardrooms. A McKinsey strategist in Boston trades Red Sox tickets for handset forecasts. A Moody's analyst in San Jose swaps college basketball tips for upcoming revenue metrics. Raj pays in flattery, promise of future favors, and, when necessary, cash wired through consulting contracts labeled Industry Insight. Each tip seems harmless in isolation like a snowflake, but collect enough and an avalanche forms. For 5 years, Galleon posts returns that shame its rivals. Investors celebrate the firm as a beacon of sharp analysis amid the noise. Raj hosts charity galas, poses with Nobel laureates, donates to children's hospitals. Yet the smallest fissures appear where silence weighs heaviest. Danielle watches senior traders delete messages each evening with near-religious discipline. Adam rehearses code phrases. "The hat size is changing, we lost the umbrella." That sound absurd out of context. She asks him once if they're safe. Adam's eyes narrow, equal parts warning and reassurance. Compliance checks volume, not intent. "Stay disciplined, you'll be fine." Disciplined, Danielle tells herself, is just another word for careful. But the avalanche has a witness. Thomas Harden, ranger to friends, manages a microfund in Gramercy. He once received a hot tip from Galleon, traded on it, and doubled his quarterly return. The euphoria faded when 2 FBI agents appeared at his door holding a thick binder of phone logs. They offered a choice: cooperate or join the list of targets. Ranger, nerves shredded, agrees to wear a wire. Over 8 agonizing months he records whispered lunches, late-night calls, scraps of jargon that, when threaded together, reveal a lattice of illegal trades orbiting Galleon's sun. October 6, 2009, dawns cool and crystalline. Raj, sipping masala chai, studies pre-market screens when his assistant announces 2 visitors, government IDs. The agents enter, suits crisp, expressions unreadable. A receptionist watches them pass framed magazine covers proclaiming king of the quants. Inside Raj's office, they hand him a grand jury subpoena. One asks, almost politely, what the term channel check means to him. Raj's smile falters only a hair. He summons legal counsel, assures staff it's a misunderstanding, then retreats to a glass conference room that suddenly feels too transparent. That afternoon, news of the probe scrolls across financial terminals. Investors withdraw $1 billion within 24 hours, as if Galleon's gilded name hides a contagion. Adam's calls go unanswered. One source sends a single text: "Lose my number." Danielle, numb, watches her positions unwind at staggering cost. She remembers an ethics professor's warning: the market forgets gains but never forgives sin. She wonders why that sounded theoretical at the time. Wiretaps, it turns out, do not capture only numbers. They capture tone, timing, the sigh before a confession. Prosecutors play juries clips of Raj discussing "our friends at Intel," the 2-cent whisper beat, and whether the radio's clear. Each word feels mundane alone, damning together. The defense argues he merely traded on expert analysis, but the jury hears something colder: knowledge fenced off from ordinary investors. On May 11, 2011, Raj stands in federal court, tie knotted too tight, as the forewoman utters guilty on all 14 counts. He blinks rapidly, like a man adjusting to sudden darkness. Danielle attends in the back row, invisible, having already pled to lesser charges in exchange for testimony. Adam avoids her gaze, escorted by marshals to a separate proceeding. Outside, reporters swarm like startled gulls, shouting questions nobody answers. Wall Street carries on. New funds launch, old ones fade, and the market's tick-tock rhythm resumes. Yet traders still lower their voices when discussing unpublished earnings, as if walls might bloom ears overnight. In midtown bars they joke about the Raj discount, the extra caution priced into every off-record tidbit. The Galleon offices sit empty now, lease taken by a fintech startup whose interns do yoga at dawn. Still, sometimes the night guard swears he hears a phone buzz after midnight, as though the whisper network lingers, searching the dark for someone willing to listen. At dawn, the milk trucks rolled through the foggy lanes of Parma like slow, white ships, their cargo destined for the shining stainless steel tanks of Parmalat Spa. From the outside, the company looked like an Italian miracle, family-owned yet global, humble cartons of latte pura stacked in village shops and Manhattan delis alike. Callisto Tanzi, the soft-voiced founder with owl-round glasses, was lauded as the Milk King, proof that old-world craftsmanship could conquer modern finance. Behind the pastel packaging, though, a different story curdled in silence. The first sign of spoilage appeared in 1999, when a junior treasury analyst noticed an interest payment routed through a new Cayman subsidiary called Bondlab. The amount, €75 million, seemed large for what the paperwork labeled inventory financing. He asked a supervisor, who shrugged and said offshore structures were normal for tax efficiency. But the analyst kept a photocopy, tucking it into a personal folder marked Strano. Strange. Tanzi, meanwhile, toured stock exchanges from Milan to New York, promising endless growth. Parmalat issued corporate bonds in tidy, photogenic tranches, each prospectus glowing with steady margins and a balance sheet rich in cash. Analysts applauded. Pension funds, hungry for safe yield, devoured every offering. Television adverts showed children chasing a sunlit cow through alpine meadows, while voiceovers spoke of purity. Few viewers grasped the irony that the company's liquidity was as fictional as the smiling bovine. By 2001, Bonolat's reported assets exceeded €3 billion, nearly a quarter of Parmalat's balance sheet, yet auditors never set foot on the island. Instead, they received faxed bank statements from Bank of America's Cayman branch affirming vast cash deposits. The characters in the fax header shifted slightly from month to month, but no one compared fonts. Deloitte, the external auditor, stamped its approvals after late-night meetings where Parmalat managers calmly produced answers to every query. Suspicion slid off those answers like cream off warm milk. Inside headquarters, a tight circle handled the real numbers: Tanzi, his right hand, Fausto Tana, and a Swiss financier named Carlo. They spoke in murmured Modenese dialect, even during conference calls, reducing complex fraud to village gossip no outsider could decode. Whenever short-term bills came due, Tana conjured fresh debt through private placements, then cycled the proceeds to cover the maturing notes. The maneuver worked like a perpetual juggle. As long as no creditor demanded the balls all at once, gravity could be temporarily ignored. Yet gravity keeps its own ledger. In the summer of 2003, a bond trader at Merrill Lynch questioned why a dairy company held more cash than Nestle yet still paid junk bond spreads. He wrote a skeptical note, and hedge funds began shorting Parmalat stock. Tanzi responded by buying a local soccer team and sponsoring Formula One racing, flooding media with images of triumph. The share price stabilized, but the cost of maintaining the illusion rose. Bonlat now showed a €500 million profit it could never wire home without revealing the void. December 15th cracked the shell. Bank of America, receiving relentless confirmation requests from a hedge fund researcher, finally examined the account number on Bonlat's statements. No such account existed. The bank issued a terse letter. The documents were forgeries. Parmalat's board, meeting in a walnut-paneled room that smelled faintly of Parmesan rind, stared at the single-page denial like parishioners confronted with heresy. Tana excused himself, walked to the restroom, and never returned. He fled out a side door to a waiting car bound for Lugano. Italian magistrates moved quickly. Tanzi was arrested 3 days before Christmas, led from his villa while neighbors clutched shopping bags of panettone and shook their heads in disbelief. In custody, he spoke gently of mistakes, of financial gymnastics, meant only to buy time until genuine profits caught up. Investigators tallied the deficit. €14 billion, the largest corporate hole in European history, enough to drain the milk of an entire continent. Employees arrived after the holidays to find security guards turning keys in reverse, locking offices that yesterday bustled with export orders. Farmers who had extended generous payment terms now faced ruin. Their herds could not wait for justice. In Parma's cafes, patrons stirred espresso and whispered that the Tanzi family had once donated hospital wings and sponsored choir festivals. Good deeds, someone muttered, can be paid for with counterfeit coins. During trial, prosecutors displayed the forged faxes on a projection screen. Enlarged, the letters seemed to wobble as if ashamed. Tanzi, frail in a gray cardigan, listened as witnesses described empty warehouses entered into inventory, shell companies with directors who had died years earlier, entire tanker fleets that existed only on spreadsheets. He offered a soft apology, claiming he never intended harm, only preservation. The courtroom lights flickered once, and the judge remarked that truth, like milk, cannot be left unrefrigerated without consequence. Sentencing delivered 27 years, later reduced on appeal but heavy enough to eclipse his legacy. Tana received 10. Deloitte faced inquiries and settlements. Its Parma office closed, shutters drawn against a future that smelled of litigation. Small investors, pensioners in Bologna, retirees in Dublin, lost life savings. They learned that trust printed on carton sides can spill as easily as milk from an overturned pail. Parmalat survived, restructured under new management, but the brand's once bright logo now carries a faint watermark of caution. Trucks still wind through the dawn mist of Emilia-Romagna, yet farmers glance at invoices twice, fingers tracing each line as if Braille could warn them before ink turns invisible. Somewhere, in a dusty desk drawer, the junior analyst's folder labeled Strano rests beneath a coil of twine, a modest relic of the first question that went unanswered. And on quiet nights, the church bells of Parma toll across empty cobblestones, a steady reminder that even the purest glass of milk can hide shadows if no one holds it to the light. The elevator to the 17th floor of the Lipstick Building on 3rd Avenue rose without a sound, its mirrored walls reflecting the early morning hush of Midtown. When the doors opened, the reception area for Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities felt improbably modest. Off-white walls, taupe carpet, no art, no trophies. Clients said the restraint exuded confidence. A man who truly controls money need not advertise it. They took the subdued lighting as proof of integrity, unaware that just beyond a locked side door, a second office, dubbed the back, hid machines that printed statements for millions that did not exist. Bernard Madoff himself preferred the front room. He sat at a mahogany desk angled toward the window, silver cuff links catching dawn light, greeting visitors with the soft rasp of a former lifeguard turned market sage. He spoke of split-strike conversions, a strategy he described as dull, almost pastoral, weaving long-dated options around blue-chip stocks to harvest small, steady gains. Clients nodded, grateful to be spared jargon. In truth, the jargon was the disguise. The strategy never left paper. Deposits flowed in, payouts flowed out, and the difference accumulated in a Chase account labeled 703. The first hairline crack appeared in 1992, when a young SEC examiner named Megan Harris reviewed trade tickets from Madoff's advisory arm. She noticed that the reported volume sometimes exceeded the actual float of certain S&P 100 names on specific days. She drafted a memo, adding politely that the anomaly was worth a closer look. Her supervisor, drowning in more flamboyant cases, shrugged. Bernie was a former NASDAQ chairman, a pillar. Besides, the firm cleared through reputable brokers. Mismatched volumes were probably a reconciliation quirk. The memo vanished into a filing cabinet, drawer E11. Over the years, the myth deepened. Country club whisper networks and charitable galas became feeder systems. Money managers funneled client funds to Bernie for a modest fee, promising returns that never dipped below 9%, never spiked above 12, a yield curve smoothed like silk. Skepticism occasionally surfaced. A derivatives expert named Harry Markopoulos once calculated that Madoff would need to trade more options than existed to achieve his consistency. He sent a 14-page analysis to the SEC titled, "The World's Largest Ponzi Scheme." The agency opened an inquiry, phoned Madoff, received manila envelopes of immaculate statements, and closed the file without on-site verification. Consistency, it seemed, could lull even watchdogs. Meanwhile, in the back office, a curt man named Frank DePascali orchestrated the fiction. IBM printers chattered overnight, producing account statements with trades matched to historical highs and lows, as if the portfolio had threaded each needle with clairvoyant grace. When markets fell sharply, DePascali backdated option hedges. When markets soared, he printed buys near the trough. The timing looked preternatural yet plausible. There was always a footnote citing OTC liquidity. Employees on that floor were told never to discuss their work with the traders up front. Most obeyed, comforted by annual bonuses that could buy summer homes in Montauk. December 2008 arrived like a steel door slamming shut. Lehman had collapsed, hedge funds were bleeding, and Madoff's investors, many of them charities, requested redemptions totaling $7 billion. Bernie, now 70, paced his penthouse living room on East 64th, robe cinched loosely, muttering that he could stall, maybe borrow, maybe bridge the gap. But the 703 account held only a fraction of what he owed. On December 10th, he summoned his two adult sons, Mark and Andrew, to the apartment. They assumed it was another crisis meeting about market turmoil. Bernie sat them on the cream-colored sofa and, voice barely above a whisper, confessed, "It's all one big lie." The brothers, stunned, contacted an attorney who dialed the FBI. The next morning, agents arrived at the duplex. One asked if there was an innocent explanation. Bernie shook his head gently, almost relieved. "No," he said. "There is no innocent explanation." They placed him in handcuffs as the doorman watched, eyes wide. Midtown traffic sighed below, indifferent. In the days that followed, incredulity metastasized. French aristocrats, Florida retirees, and Manhattan philanthropies realized they shared a single fate. A cancer research foundation shut its doors. A university endowment halted scholarships. Journalists camped outside the Lipstick Building, lenses trained on drawn blinds. Inside, agents cataloged binders of blank trade tickets, shelves of unmailed confirmation slips, and stacks of pre-printed envelopes never destined for a clearinghouse. Court proceedings moved swiftly. Madoff waived trial, pleading guilty to 11 counts of fraud, money laundering, and perjury. During sentencing, investors described lives unspooled, mortgages called, charities gutted, trust immolated. Bernie, in a charcoal suit 2 sizes too large, addressed the room without notes. He said he was sorry, that he had started the scheme in the early 90s after a bad trade, intending to unwind it quickly, but success bred expectation and expectation bred fear. Words folded into silence. The judge spoke of extraordinary evil, imposing 150 years, a number chosen less for restitution than for symbolism, a temporal monument to broken faith. The lipstick offices were dismantled. Desks auctioned, carpet ripped up, walls repainted for a fintech startup chasing disruption of its own. Yet the 17th floor retains a peculiar hush, as if sound itself hesitates. The file cabinet labeled E11 was sent to storage. Megan Harris's memo surfaced in a congressional hearing, the paper yellowed, the warning unheeded. She watched on C-SPAN from a suburban kitchen, wondering how history might have changed had someone listened. Some evenings, commuters on the Lexington line passed the shimmering tower and recalled the saga as cautionary folklore, a reminder that steady returns may mask quiet catastrophes. Madoff died in prison in 2021, but his victims still trace spreadsheets, hoping for slivers of restitution. Trust, they've learned, compounds more slowly than any investment and evaporates faster than ink on counterfeit tickets. And somewhere, in an archive of SEC correspondence, the memo stands like a lighthouse whose beam was missed, illuminating nothing but the emptiness left behind. Morning broke over La Défense in pale bands of lavender, glass towers catching the first glints of light like enormous prisms. On the 23rd floor of Helios Tower, Émile Caradec's office already hummed. Screens showed deep green matrices of numbers, carbon emission allowances EUAs, trading on Bluenext, the exchange Paris had built for a cleaner future. To Émile, the credits looked less like environmental policy and more like liquid gold. Each unit represented 1 ton of avoided CO2, yet it behaved like any other commodity. Bought, sold, sometimes forgotten. The market was young, the rules evolving, and where rules are soft, fortunes congeal. Émile was 36, impeccably dressed, and the sole director of Ferras Trading S.R.O., a firm with 6 employees and, according to its glossy brochure, a commitment to climate integrity. In truth, Ferras was a node in a vast carousel. Carbon credits bought VAT-free in one EU country, sold at full price in France, and the value-added tax, 20%, quietly pocketed instead of remitted to the treasury. The maneuver relied on speed. Credits moved across borders in milliseconds, invoices arriving seconds later, the money flowing before tax inspectors could assemble the puzzle. The French press would later call it La Fraude du siècle, but on this particular April day in 2009, it felt merely like business. The scheme began almost accidentally. 2 years earlier, Émile's college friend, a Belgian IT contractor named Luc Verhegen, phoned late one night, voice crackling with excitement. "There's a loophole," he said. "Carbon permits are intangible. Move them quickly enough and VAT becomes optional." Émile, then a modest energy analyst, listened in silence. By morning he had drafted a plan. Create shell firms in Belgium and Luxembourg, open correspondent accounts in Zurich, hire a programmer to automate trades so rapid they would appear as flickers on the exchange log. Ferras would play the starring role in France, where VAT rates were highest and regulators still treated carbon as a niche curiosity. For 18 months, the carousel spun flawlessly. A Romanian broker sold 100,000 credits to Ferras at €13 each, VAT exempt under intra-community rules. Ferras immediately resold them to a French utility for €15.60. Original cost plus market spread plus VAT. The utility paid the invoice in full, convinced it was fulfilling a green energy quota. Ferras forwarded the €1.3 million cost of goods back to Romania, minus a slender commission, but kept the €260,000 VAT. Paperwork declared it would be sent to the state at quarter end. It never was. Émile justified the fraud as temporary arbitrage. Governments had designed the market in haste, he argued. Surely they expected savvy traders to uncover pricing anomalies. He promised himself he would exit before anyone was hurt, return the funds even. Yet each month delivered new temptations. A view of the Seine from a renovated Haussmann flat, vintage Bordeaux for client dinners, a midnight test drive of an electric sports car that whispered along the boulevard like a secret. Integrity, he discovered, erodes in increments too small to notice. The first tremor arrived via an email from Bluenext's compliance team headed, "Request for trade clarification, urgent." They had observed an unusual concentration of volume passing through Ferras in 30-second bursts, always at daybreak when liquidity was thin. Could Émile furnish counterparty confirmations? He drafted a polite reply, attached PDFs manufactured moments earlier, and reminded himself to breathe. Still, a note of unease entered his voice when he phoned Luc. "Time to slow," he said. Luc laughed. "We'll stop when the Eiffel Tower goes carbon neutral." Across town, Inspector Claire Doucet of France's Brigade Nationale de Répression de la Délinquance Financière, BNRDF, was assembling her own mosaic. She had been tasked with investigating a puzzling gap in VAT receipts from environmental commodities. At first she suspected clerical error, perhaps a coding glitch. Then she noticed identical invoices from 3 ostensibly unrelated firms bearing the same timestamp down to the second. Algorithms might explain synchronous trading, she mused, but invoices were human artifacts. She pinned the documents on a board, red thread linking them to a single IP address. Ferras Trading. June 16, 2009, dawned heavy with humidity. At 6:04 a.m., Émile's algorithm executed what would become the final carousel. 450,000 credits cycling through 5 jurisdictions in under 2 minutes. By 6:10 a.m., 9.1 million euros of phantom VAT sat in a Zurich account under the name Calypso Holdings. Emil poured espresso, tasted its bitterness and felt, for the first time, a flicker of dread rather than triumph. 2 days later, while he lunched on sea-based ceviche at La Maison Blanche, Claire's team stepped onto the marble lobby of Helios Tower, warrants in hand. They moved quickly, sealing servers in anti-static bags, escorting staff to a conference room converted into a temporary holding area. Emil returned to find the reception desk unmanned, police tape across the glass door, and Claire waiting. She spoke softly, almost sympathetically, asking for passwords, trade logs, the logic of the algorithm. Emil thought of denying everything, then pictured the Zurich account, traceable, undeniable. He provided the first code, a gesture less of cooperation than of resignation. News of the raids exploded across Europe. Headlines lamented billions in lost tax revenue, money meant for schools, hospitals, perhaps even real climate projects. Politicians condemned the eco-pirates, who had turned planetary rescue into a personal jackpot. Emil's face appeared on evening broadcasts, eyes bewildered, as if he himself had just discovered the depth of the hole he dug. The trial, held in a stately Parisian courtroom with frescoed ceilings, lasted 4 months. Prosecutors traced 1.8 billion euros in fraudulent VAT through a constellation of 23 shell companies. Ferros accounted for nearly a quarter. Witnesses included bankers, programmers, and a sheepish utility executive who admitted he'd never questioned invoices as long as credits arrived on time. Emil, in charcoal suit and modest tie, confessed quietly. "I believed I was ahead of the curve," he said. "Instead, I was outside the law." The sentence, 7 years plus a lifetime ban from financial markets, felt both heavy and light. Heavy for a white-collar crime once dismissed as accounting mischief, light against the public coffers still gasping from the loss. Luke was arrested in Antwerp after months on the run and received 5. Calypso's Zurich funds transferred back to France barely covered interest on the missing billions. Today, the carbon market operates with new safeguards: real-time registry matching, cross-border VAT harmonization, anomaly flags that pulse red at the faintest whiff of a carousel. Yet cynics say ingenuity always outraces regulation. From his cell in France, Emil sometimes imagines credits still swirling in cyberspace, weightless yet potent, a digital fog no hand can grasp. He wonders whether the planet feels any lighter for the tons never truly offset, or whether the atmosphere, like the Treasury, keeps its own silent books. Outside, Paris continues to pledge carbon neutrality by 2050. Somewhere along the embankment, a tourist buys a carton of organic almond milk stamped 100% emission compensated, and drinks it without tasting the ghost of vanished VAT that once floated, invisible, in the air above. At precisely 11:28 a.m. each weekday, the open-plan trading floor at UBS's London headquarters took on a ritual hush. Screens flickered with the usual kaleidoscope of interest rate swaps, yet countless eyes drifted toward a digital clock mounted above the whiteboard. 2 minutes later, the London Interbank offered rate, LIBOR, would be set for the day, fixing the price of trillions in loans, mortgages, and derivatives. To most bankers, the rate was a barometer, observed, not touched. To Tom Hayes, a boyish derivatives trader with a nervous laugh and polar fleece jacket slung over his chair, it was soft clay waiting for a sculptor. Tom's talent was pattern spotting. He could glance at an array of euro-yen basis swaps and glimpse an arbitrage no algorithm had found. That gift earned him a move from the middle office to the star desk in 2006. There, he discovered a second gift, an unspoken fraternity among LIBOR submitters. Each morning, 19 banks phoned in the rates at which they claimed they could borrow unsecured money. Thomson Reuters dropped the highest and lowest quartile, then averaged the rest, an arithmetic so simple it bordered on naive. A gentleman's estimate, one old-school manager called it. Tom heard opportunity. It began innocently. An options book he inherited would bleed millions if 6-month yen LIBOR nudged even half a basis point higher. He rang a contact at Citi. "Any chance you can post a slightly lower 6-month today? We're heavy on the long side." The voice on the other end chuckled, "What's it worth?" They settled on a pint at the White Horse after close. Minutes later, UBS's own submitter slid a request across chat. "Tom needs low 6-month." At 11:30, Yen Libor fixed down by 0.003%. The book sighed with relief. Tom's P&L blipped green. One favor. One drink. No harm. The favors multiplied. Tom kept a spreadsheet dubbed Cabinet, cataloging who owed him and who required coaxing. Submitters in Tokyo needing Wimbledon tickets. Counterparts in New York angling for job leads in Singapore. Electronic chats sprouted colloquial shorthand. Low Libor please K-checks. Any way you can high threes today? Emojis softened the requests as though smiley faces could cloak intent. Compliance filters flagged curse words but ignored manipulation spelled in politeness. Hayes's desk manager, dazzled by record profits, asked no questions. UBS paid Tom a £3 million bonus. He bought a modest house in Surrey, insisting to friends that he was just lucky with basis spreads. Yet the market whispers grew. A Canadian bank quipped in an internal memo that Libor is like teabags, good for one dip, useless after. Regulators in Washington noticed strange kinks in 3-month dollar Libor during quarter ends. At first they assumed liquidity stress, then they lined up chat logs and saw a choreography invisible to the public. Traders on separate continents synchronizing submissions to the thousandth of a point. In March 2010, the UK's Financial Services Authority sent UBS a request for communications related to Libor. The letter arrived at 8:17 a.m. By 9:30, legal counsel gathered Tom and a handful of submitters in a windowless room. Phones surrendered, laptops checked. Counsel explained that regulators suspected anomalous patterns. Tom's foot twitched under the table. He remembered every favor tallied in Cabinet, every winking emoji, every pint. He thought of deleting the file, then realized the servers kept automatic backups. The past was indelible. UBS cooperated, handing over millions of chat messages. Tom was placed on paid leave, then dismissed. He flew to Tokyo, hoping the distance might dilute scrutiny. Instead, Japanese authorities raided the branch within weeks. Arrest felt abstract until 2 special fraud investigators appeared at his apartment door, bowing slightly before presenting warrants written in kanji he could barely read. They escorted him through neon-lit streets to a precinct where the fluorescent light never dimmed. Extradited to London in 2012, Tom faced charges under the Fraud Act and the newly minted Financial Services Act. His defense was disarmingly simple. Everyone did it. Jury members heard recordings of traders bantering, "Mate, you owe me big time for the threes fix," and wondered where camaraderie ended and conspiracy began. Prosecutors argued that intent was clear: manipulate a benchmark to enrich the book. The defense countered that the Libor process relied on subjective judgment. Nudging a number by micropoints was industry custom, not criminal enterprise. After 7 weeks, the jury delivered its verdict: guilty on all 8 counts. Tom, 35, stood rigid as the judge described the crime as spreading through the banking industry like a stain. The sentence, 14 years, later cut to 11 on appeal, echoed across trading floors. Libor, once a sleepy index, became radioactive. Compliance departments installed real-time monitors, flagged any message mentioning the word low, and forced traders through ethics seminars thick with legal citations. UBS paid a $1.5 billion fine, Barclays, Deutsche Bank, and RBS billions more. The British Bankers Association surrendered administration of Libor to the Intercontinental Exchange, which introduced transaction-based submissions and algorithmic sanity checks. Even so, cynics observed that the rate still relied partly on judgment. Only now judgment lived under spotlights. Tom serves his time in HM Prison Lodham Grange. He tutors fellow inmates in basic math and requests textbooks on probability theory. In interviews he insists he never foresaw the fallout, that micropoints seem trivial against the colossal numbers markets shuffle daily. The world wanted certainty, he says. We supplied it, fabricated, perhaps, but consistent. Outside, homeowners recalculate mortgage payments, governments debate retiring Libor entirely by 2023, and traders memorize new acronyms, SOFR, Sonia, promising integrity by design. Yet some lessons linger only in human memory. Each weekday at 11:30 a.m., the digital clock above UBS's updated trading floor still pulses, though fewer eyes rise to meet it. The hush has been replaced by algorithmic hum, but veterans remember the old ritual. They recall how 2 minutes once separated harmless chat from criminal conspiracy, how a fraction of a basis point could tilt billions. and they wonder, quietly, where the next soft clay awaits the sculptor's hand. The Wolfsburg testing lab smelled faintly of rubber and metal, the scent of 1,000 engines exhaling under fluorescent lights. Jacob Weiss, a slight software engineer with meticulous handwriting, stood beside a stationary Volkswagen Passat while a dynamometer spun its wheels at highway speed. On the monitor, nitrogen oxide emissions hovered well below the new U.S. limit. The numbers looked perfect, too perfect, Jacob thought, because out on real roads the same engine spewed 5, sometimes 30 times more pollution. He knew why. Buried in the electronic control unit was a dozen lines of C code nicknamed the acoustic function, a polite euphemism for defeat device. When the steering wheel remained fixed and the rear wheels idle, signatures of a lab test, the code dialed back combustion, sacrificing power for cleanliness. The moment the car sensed real-world variables, wheel angle, barometric wiggle, it reverted to full performance. Clean in theory, dirty in traffic. That was the trade Volkswagen had chosen when marketing its diesel sedans as clean TDI. Jacob's part was small. Adjust injection timing, log data, never ask why certain flags triggered only under test conditions. Officially, the software improved engine acoustics. Unofficially, it masked non-compliance with regulations the company deemed unrealistic. In meetings, senior managers described American emission laws as übertrieben, over the top, and promised a future hardware fix. Until then, software would bridge the gap. The project carried an internal code beginning with the digits 23. Volkswagen shorthand that the feature, if discovered, could cost billions. Across the Atlantic, in Ann Arbor, Michigan, two engineers at West Virginia University, Arvind Thiravangadam and Mark Besch, prepared a white RV for a cross-country study of diesel emissions. They borrowed portable testing equipment, strapped it to the exhaust pipes of 3 cars, 2 VWs and a BMW, and set off toward the Rockies. Their mandate, funded by the International Council on Clean Transportation, seemed routine, confirmed that European diesels met US standards in real life. But as the miles unraveled, the monitors painted a different story. The BMW hovered within limits. The Volkswagen spiked again and again, especially on uphill climbs. By the time they reached San Diego, the researchers had logged anomalies impossible to dismiss. They double-checked calibrations, swapped sensors, repeated routes. The pattern held. In May 2014, they sent their findings to the California Air Resources Board, CRB. The email was polite, almost tentative, as though they feared they had misread the data. CARB did not. Investigators summoned Volkswagen's U.S. technical liaison, Oliver Schmidt, to Sacramento. Schmidt, confident and charismatic, insisted the discrepancies stemmed from a minor software glitch, perhaps an unaccounted altitude parameter. He promised a swift fix and returned to headquarters in Herndon, Virginia, where he forwarded CARB's demands to Wolfsburg with a subject line that read simply, "Important, please advise." Back in Germany, crisis meetings convened behind glass walls. Engineers, lawyers, and public relations staff filled a conference room nicknamed the Aquarium because passers-by could glimpse frantic gestures through tinted panels. Jacob sat near the back, notebook closed, listening as managers debated patches that might appease regulators without revealing the defeat device. One executive suggested blaming customers for improper maintenance. Another proposed voluntary recalls couched as emission optimizations. The room settled on a strategy: stall, provide technical fog, and hope the Americans relented. CARB did not relent. They demanded raw calibration maps, bench tests, explanations for torque inconsistencies. Each answer bred new questions. Senior Vice President Heinz Jacob Neusser wrote a memo warning that continued deception risked a nightmare scenario. Still, upper management hesitated, fearing lawsuits, stock crashes, and the shattering of Volkswagen's carefully burnished image. Das Auto. September 3, 2015, finally broke the standoff. During a tense video call, a VW engineer in a gray sweater, his name later redacted in court filings, admitted to CARB and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency that yes, a defeat device existed. Silence followed, thick enough to feel. The Americans ended the call with a warning: public disclosure was now inevitable. On September 18, the EPA issued a notice of violation. Global headlines coined a label, Dieselgate, that fused industrial pride with scandal's stain. Volkswagen stock price plunged 30% in 2 days, erasing tens of billions in market value. CEO Martin Winterkorn appeared in a hastily filmed apology, spectacles glinting under studio lights, vowing to get to the bottom of this. Within weeks' end, he resigned. Jacob, who had never spoken to Winterkorn, cleared his desk discreetly, placing 2 engineers' notebooks in a canvas bag. One contained harmless calibration tables. The other held printed code fragments annotated with the phrase cyclocircanum, cycle detection. He considered shredding it, then decided the record mattered. Outgoing security waved him through without a glance. By then, hundreds were doing the same. Courtrooms soon replaced conference rooms. In Detroit, prosecutors unveiled indictments describing a conspiracy to defraud the United States. Jacob cooperated, trading testimony for immunity. Oliver Schmidt, arrested while vacationing in Florida, received 7 years. Volkswagen pled guilty, paying $4.3 billion in criminal and civil penalties on top of $20 billion in buybacks and fixes. The company promised an electric future, all zero emission and contrition. Yet losses cannot be calibrated like torque. Asthma rates betrayed customers, the quiet erosion of faith in green promises. Those numbers scatter beyond spreadsheets. Even now, some drivers keep their original diesels, preferring performance over the software patch that dulls acceleration. The cars run like restless ghosts, cleaner in labs than on boulevards, reminders that data can be as malleable as exhaust in the wind. Jacob lives in Bremen, teaching vocational math. He bikes to work, passing rows of new EV charging stations, their cords coiled like good intentions. Sometimes he stops at a traffic light behind an older Passat and imagines the hidden code still whispering its conditional orders. The tailpipe looks harmless, a simple rim of steel. But Jacob knows how invisibility works. You cannot see deceit, only the shadows it leaves when sunlight finally finds the smoke. Long before the billboards and magazine covers, the idea fit inside a single sentence Elizabeth Holmes wrote in a Stanford dorm room: change the way blood is tested. She was 19, whispered her plan to anyone who would listen, and soon left the university clutching provisional patents and a vision larger than the lab she abandoned. By 2004, she had leased a windowless suite on Hillview Avenue in Palo Alto, naming her company Theranos, a portmanteau of therapy and diagnosis. She wore a black turtleneck in homage to an idol she never met and lowered her voice to a near whisper, so listeners leaned in, eager co-conspirators before they understood the plot. The promise was seductively simple: a few drops from a finger prick, dozens of tests, results in hours instead of days. No more vials, no more bruised veins, no more waiting rooms thick with anxiety. Venture capitalists, fatigued by yet another social media app, heard salvation and profit in the hum of miniature centrifuges Holmes described as iPods for health. They wrote checks that glinted with 8 zeros, and Theranos rose behind frosted glass etched with a single slogan: one tiny drop changes everything. Inside, the reality sliced differently. The Edison, the size of a toaster oven, was supposed to spin blood through microfluidic channels, add reagents, and beam light through samples to produce data. In practice, it jammed, leaked, overheated, and, most dangerously, produced wildly scattered numbers. Software engineer Arjun Shah watched potassium readings swing from lethal lows to sky-high errors on the same sample. He reported the anomaly to a lanky lab director named Sunny Balwani, who stared back, unblinking, and replied, "Fix your process." The phrase became a mantra: when numbers misbehaved, blame the messenger. Holmes spoke often of stealth mode, forbidding employees to discuss work across departments. She sealed hardware teams on one floor, chemists on another, each badge color-coded, each hallway lined with security cameras. In all-hands meetings, she cited secrecy as competitive advantage, but it functioned better as insulation. The board, illustrious statesmen with expertise in diplomacy rather than diagnostics, accepted glossy slide decks depicting validation in progress. They believed because disbelief would mean admitting they were out of their depth. By 2013, Theranos struck a deal with Walgreens, branded wellness centers inside hundreds of pharmacies. Executives toured the lab, signing non-disclosure agreements so thick they felt like scripture. Machines were demonstrated only behind a glass partition. Tests run on pre-screened blood kept at ideal temperature. The visitors left impressed. The partnership launched in Arizona within the year. Consumers lined up, sleeves rolled, reassured by the futuristic white pods installed near the pharmacy counter. Samples vanished into opaque tubes bound for a Theranos lab where out-of-sight technicians quietly diluted them and ran them on relabeled Siemens analyzers, the very legacy machines the company claimed to disrupt. Dissonance gathered mass. Two young staffers, Tyler Schultz and Erica Chung, noticed control flags ignored and patient reports released despite quality control failures. When Chung raised concerns, a senior manager slid a printed termination form across the desk, pen uncapped, and suggested she reconsider her questions. She walked out that day heart thudding and wrote a detailed complaint to federal regulators under penalty of perjury. Schultz, the grandson of board member George Schultz, confronted Holmes directly. She thanked him for his passion, then unleashed lawyers from Boies Schiller armed with confidentiality clauses and veiled threats of litigation that could bankrupt a recent college graduate. Tyler's parents mortgaged their house to fund his legal defense. Meanwhile, Wall Street Journal reporter John Carreyrou received an anonymous email signed simply "Concerned." It described tests run on conventional machines, phantom validations, and fear-drenched hallways. Carreyrou called former employees in cautious whispers, cross-checked internal documents, and, crucially, secured on-the-record interviews with Schultz and Chung. Holmes learned of the probe and phoned the journal's editor, invoking national security partnerships and proprietary secrets. The paper held firm. On October 15, 2015, Carreyrou's article landed like a clinical diagnosis no bedside manner could soften. Theranos tests, it alleged, were unreliable. The Edison handled only a fraction of advertised assays. Most samples were shipped to standard labs. Holmes appeared on CNBC hours later, eyes bright, stating, "This is what happens when you work to change things. First they think you're crazy, then they fight you." Viewers heard conviction. Skeptics heard deflection. Regulators accelerated. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services inspected Theranos' Newark, California, lab and found deficient procedures, unqualified staff, stored blood beside lunchboxes. They revoked the license, barred Holmes and Balwani from owning or operating labs for 2 years, later extended. Walgreens closed every wellness center, writing off $140 million. Investors sued, the board splintered, employees scattered to biotech firms where silence didn't feel like complicity. In 2018, a federal grand jury indicted Holmes and Balwani on multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy. The government argued they had lied to patients, doctors, and investors, valuing growth over truth. The defense painted Holmes as a visionary who believed her own timeline, a founder guilty of optimism, not deception. After a 4-month trial punctuated by testimony about forged Pfizer logos and manipulated Excel graphs, the jury convicted her on 4 fraud counts related to investors. She awaits sentencing. Balwani faces a separate verdict. The Hillview Avenue building sits vacant, company logo pried from the facade, reception area littered with unopened mail. A cleaning crew once found a single Edison device abandoned in a corner, glossy shell intact, internals gutted, an empty promise in plastic. At Stanford, freshmen in biotech ethics courses study Theranos as cautionary text. They debate ambition's edge where bold becomes reckless. In lecture halls, professors remind them that blood carries stories molecules do not forgive. On quiet evenings, Tyler Schultz walks past a shuttered Walgreens in Scottsdale, neon sign dark, and recalls the day he first pricked his own finger to test a system he hoped would help millions. The memory tastes of iron and regret. He still believes small samples can change medicine, just not when truth is diluted to invisibility. The lesson lingers in that scarlet drop. Science, unlike showmanship, cannot be convinced, it must be proven. A Houston dusk shimmered against the blue glass tower at 1400 Smith Street, wrapping Enron's headquarters in molten orange light. From a distance the building looked solid, but inside, Andrew Fastow felt the structure was made of reflections. Images bouncing between conference rooms, polished shoes, and PowerPoint slides until no one could tell what was real. He was 40, sharp-eyed, and newly crowned Chief Financial Officer of America's most admired energy company. On evenings like this, he stayed late, laptop glowing in an otherwise darkened office, arranging numbers the way a stage magician arranges cards, swiftly, confidently, and always with an exit already mapped. The pressure to dazzle began long before Fastow's spreadsheets. Jeffrey Skilling, Enron's silver-tongued president, had promised Wall Street perpetual acceleration. Revenues up, Debt vanished, volatility harnessed like wind in a giant sail. Traders on the 6th floor, the guys with the cowboy boots, employees joked, delivered soaring profits one quarter, then stumbled the next. Skilling insisted the line on earnings calls must never dip. When reality lagged, he told Fasto, "We innovate." The word sounded noble. In practice, it meant building private partnerships that borrowed against tomorrow so today could keep its shine. Fasto's first creation was LJM1, named for his wife Leah and sons Jeffrey and Matthew. The partnership bought underperforming Enron assets at inflated prices, letting the company book gains while LJM quietly financed the purchases with bank loans guaranteed by Enron stock. Risk seemed distant. Enron's share price glinted above $70, employee cafeterias buzzed with talk of early retirement, and Fortune magazine declared the firm most innovative for the 6th straight year. A culture of brilliance settled like a spell. If something felt confusing, employees assumed it was because they weren't brilliant enough. Yet in accounting, mirrors eventually reveal their backs. By 2000, LJM had spawned Raptor Structures, shadow creatures that absorbed losses from Enron's tech investments. Each time a dot-com stake slid, a Raptor swallowed the pain, letting Skilling boast another flawless quarter. The only collateral was Enron stock. If the price ever fell, the Raptors would starve and spit the losses back. Fasto knew the risk. He convinced himself markets rewarded bravery. Sharon Watkins, a senior vice president with a Texan drawl as soft as cotton, was one of the few who read the footnotes closely. One July afternoon, she traced a disclosure about equity forward contracts and felt her stomach tighten. She had managed assets long enough to sense when numbers were hollow. That night at home, she opened a fresh spiral notebook and wrote, "Massive accounting scandal waiting to erupt." The next morning she slipped the note into a drawer, unsure whom she could trust. On the trading floor, Ken Lay, Enron's genial chairman, visited desks shaking hands. He asked about families, weekend plans, never about offset positions. Employees called him Dr. Laylove, grateful for the stock options that bloomed with each earnings release. In holiday speeches he compared Enron to NASA, bound for the stars, limited only by imagination. Downstairs, janitors emptied trash cans filled with draft prospectuses for ventures that existed only as colored arrows on flowcharts. September 2001 cracked the glass. The tech bubble burst, power prices dipped, and Enron stock slid below $35. Suddenly, letters of credit linked to the Raptors required fresh collateral. Fasto convened a late-night war room. Bankers on speakerphone, lawyers hunched over fax term sheets, the air stale with microwave burritos. They patched the holes with hurried swaps, each fixed buying days, never weeks. Watkins, unable to stay silent, wrote an anonymous memo to Ken Lay titled, "Is Enron overstating its earnings?" She described Raptor obligations that could implode in a wave of losses. Lay thanked her, hired lawyers from Vinson and Elkins to review, and publicly reaffirmed Enron's strength. Shares flickered upward for a moment, then resumed their downward slide as analysts pressed harder. Why did Enron, a company claiming steady cash flow, borrow so relentlessly? Why were profits soaring while actual cash seemed to evaporate? October 16, 2001, Enron reported a $618 million quarterly loss and a $1.2 billion reduction in shareholders' equity linked to Fasto's partnerships. The disclosure, couched in soft language, struck markets like a dropped cymbal. Credit rating agencies placed the company on watch. Fasto paced his office, rehearsing talking points about non-recurring charges. Inside a filing cabinet lay half-signed promissory notes. If Enron fell, lenders could demand repayment personally. By November, the stock traded under $10. Raptors triggered full collapse. Banks demanded cash that wasn't there. Employees watched retirement accounts shrink hourly on their computer dashboards, disbelief washing into panic. Some marched to HR pleading to sell restricted shares. Policy said no. Traders who once swaggered in custom boots now stood in elevator corners avoiding eye contact. December 2, 2001, Enron filed for Chapter 11, the largest bankruptcy in U.S. history. Television helicopters hovered over the Houston Tower, recording employees carrying boxes filled with family photos and novelty mugs. In Clear Lake, retirees canceled holiday travel, their pensions tied to the fallen giant. Fasto was fired, Skilling subpoenaed, Lay summoned to congressional hearings where he lifted a hand and swore to tell the truth, voice trembling for the first time. Trials unfolded over years. Jurors saw whiteboards sketched with raptors, LJM webs, balance sheet contortions designed to please analysts. Fasto, facing 98 counts, struck a deal, 10 years in exchange for testimony. He described late-night calls, handshake approvals, a culture where questioning quarter-end targets was heresy. Skilling received 24 years, later reduced. Lay died of a heart attack before sentencing, leaving debates about accountability unfinished. The skyscraper still stands, released to oil service firms, its reflective skin capturing sunsets as vividly as ever. Tour guides rarely mention Enron now, but locals recall evenings when the tower glowed neon blue, spelling E equals MC superscript 2, during energy conferences. In a modest Houston suburb, Sharon Watkins tutors high school students in ethics, her original spiral notebook locked in a file safe. She tells them numbers are stories, and every story needs a backbone stronger than mirrors. On quiet nights, janitors ride elevators through the building's hollow core, mops rattling against stainless steel. They say the 50th floor, once Enron's executive suite, feels colder than the rest. Maybe it's the air conditioning, maybe memory. Either way, the mirrors there reflect only the present, no longer bending to desire, reminding anyone who looks that brilliance without candor can shatter under its own glittering weight.